Good evening, everyone. I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to help you fall asleep. So, before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video. I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching this, so leave it in the comments. When you're ready, get comfortable and relax. When I opened my eyes, the first thing that came over me was a white flash that forced me to close them again. A persistent ringing echoed in my ears, and every breath I took made me aware of a dull ache in my side. I didn't know where I was or why my head felt like it had been hit by a hammer. I tried to move, but something cold and rigid bound my wrist to the bed. The air smelled of disinfectant, and as I focused my eyes, I noticed I was in a hospital room. The ceiling was flat and nondescript, with those fluorescent lights that seemed to drain any trace of humanity. I turned my head to the right and saw a small metal table. On top of it was a clear plastic bag with a couple of items inside: a black watch, a set of keys, and a worn brown leather wallet. Something about them seemed strangely familiar, and at the same time, completely foreign. That's when it hit me. I had no idea who I was. I didn't remember my name, my age, or what had brought me to that place. I tried to string together some feeling or thought that would connect me to my past, but my mind was a blank canvas. Despair began to break out in a cold sweat. With effort, I sat up a little on the bed. My body protested with every movement. Looking down at my clothes, I found a hospital gown, but underneath it peeked a dark gray pair of pants. I checked the pockets. Nothing. Everything I had seemed to be in that bag. As I stretched my arm toward the table, the sudden movement caused me to drop the watch to the floor. I bent down to pick it up and noticed something engraved on the back of the dial. Some initials. AR. It meant nothing to me, but just having a hint, however small, gave me a glimmer of hope. I returned my attention to the wallet. I opened it with trembling hands and found some credit cards and a driver's license. The name said Alejandro Rivera, with an address in a neighborhood that didn't ring a bell either. I looked at the photo. It was the face of a middle-aged man, short dark hair, tired eyes. My face. I looked through the compartments of my wallet, finding a train ticket from 2 days ago, and a small photo of a woman. She was young, with brown hair and a soft smile. There was something in her eyes that looked familiar, although I couldn't remember who she was. The headache was still throbbing, as if my brain was fighting against itself to release the answers. I decided to focus on the practical. First, I had to get out of the hospital. Outside, perhaps, the pieces would start to fall into place. It wasn't hard to find my clothes on a chair next to the bed. There was a wrinkled white shirt and a dark gray jacket that matched the pants. In the inside pocket of the jacket, I found a pen with a company logo, Rivera and Associates. My last name was there. Maybe I was a lawyer or something similar. The hospital corridor was long and silent, almost desolate. No one stopped me as I moved forward. It seemed that most of the staff were busy with other patients. My immediate target was the address on my license. Maybe that place would hold answers. I stepped out into the open air and a cold shock made me cringe. The city was unfamiliar, but something about its structure seemed familiar. I walked to a nearby train station, using the ticket in my wallet. I sat by the window as the gray streets sped by. I arrived at the neighborhood listed in the address. It was a collection of old buildings with worn facades and small windows. I climbed the stairs to the apartment that corresponded to the address. The key I had on my key ring fit perfectly into the lock. Upon entering, I was greeted by a dusty and cold atmosphere, as if no one had been there in days. The place was small, just a sofa, a table with chairs, and a bed at the back. On the wall hung 2 photographs. One was the same woman as the picture in my wallet, this time with a small child. The other showed a group of men in suits, probably work colleagues. I checked the table. There was a newspaper open to a story about an accident on a nearby road. The date was from the day before. A car had crashed into a truck at high speed. The picture showed a mangled black car, which I immediately recognized as mine. Suddenly, everything began to make sense. I wasn't in the hospital because of an illness. I had survived an accident. But if that was true, why was I alone? Why hadn't anyone looked for me? The answer came in a corner of the apartment, where I found a cardboard box full of papers. There were letters addressed to me, all from a woman named Lauren. Each one told of divorce, of arguments, of a boy named Samuel whom I barely remembered. My wife and son, or rather my ex-wife and my son. The words in the letters were harsh, full of resentment. Lauren accused me of being a cold, absent, selfish man. She claimed I had abandoned our son emotionally, even though he was physically present. I felt a pang of shame and sadness as I read them. I also found documents from my work. He was a lawyer, specializing in corporate cases. Apparently, he was involved in a legal battle with a powerful company. There were notes and recordings indicating that I had been gathering evidence against them. All this seemed to give me a clear picture of my life, but it didn't explain the void in my mind. I decided to look for more answers. On my phone, I found unread messages from someone named Martin, who seemed to be a friend or colleague. I decided to go to the place where he worked according to the notes. The office was in the center of town, in a fancy building. The security guard recognized me and let me pass. As I entered, I felt a wave of familiarity hit me hard. My desk was full of folders and documents, many of them related to the case I was working on. There was also a handwritten note that read, "Meet with Lauren tonight. It's important." Then I remembered. I had been driving home when the accident happened. The appointment was to talk about something important, although I couldn't pinpoint what. I returned to the apartment with the intention of looking for any further clues. While going through a drawer, I found an envelope with no return address. Inside were pictures of me going in and out of different places. They looked like they were taken by someone who was following me. There was also a note that read, "We know what you did." A shiver ran through my body. I didn't know what it meant, but I sensed that it had something to do with the case I was working on. There was someone who did not want me to continue with my investigation, and I did not rule out that the accident had not been an accident. All of this left me with more questions than answers. Who was I really? What kind of man had I been before I lost my memory? Was I a good father, a repentant husband, or simply a man haunted by his own mistakes? My name is Alejandro Rivera, but I still don't know if I want to remember everything I have forgotten. The day my younger brother Daniel disappeared, a fine drizzle was falling, the kind that doesn't seem to wet, but clings to your skin until it soaks into your bones. I remember staring out the window that afternoon, watching the drops accumulate on the windowsill while the branches of the trees swayed in a listless sway. Everything at that moment seemed banal, routine. Daniel left the house as he always did, with his black jacket, headphones in his ears, and a backpack slung over his shoulder. He didn't say where he was going, and I didn't ask. Now, that silence, that lack of interest, weighs on me like an anchor. I've gone over that scene 1,000 times in my mind, looking for some detail I should have noticed, some sign that would alert me that something wasn't right. But there was nothing. Just the drizzle, the sound of the door closing, and the feeling that everything was in its place. The first few hours after he did not return did not alarm us. Daniel was a grown man, and it was not unusual for him to go out unannounced and return late. My mother, however, seemed uneasy. She said there was something strange about the way he said goodbye that afternoon, as if he knew he would not return. I dismissed her concern, attributing it to her overprotective nature. When the next day dawned and we didn't hear from him, things changed. We called his phone, but it went straight to voicemail. We contacted his closest friends, but none of them knew anything. One of them mentioned that the last time he had seen him, Daniel seemed a bit anxious, distracted, as if he was dealing with something he didn't want to share. The police told us they needed more time before they would consider her disappearance official, but my mother insisted that something was wrong. That's when we started our own investigation. We went through her room, her computer, anything that might give us a clue. The first thing we found was an old notebook hidden in a compartment of his desk. Inside were scattered scribbles and notations, many of them cryptic and difficult to understand. There were names and numbers we didn't recognize, along with phrases like, "trust no one," and "they know too much." These words left us with more questions than answers, but they also set off an alarm. We decided to dig deeper. We checked his email and social networks. There, we discovered that he had been in contact with a woman named Karina, someone we had never heard of. Their conversation was brief and vague, but mentioned something about a meeting to sort things out. It didn't take long to find Karina. She lived in a neighborhood on the other side of town. When we confronted her, her face paled when she heard Daniel's name. She told us she knew him from work and that they had been seeing each other secretly for months. She claimed that their relationship had ended a few weeks ago, but that he had called her recently, asking for help with a problem she wouldn't elaborate on. Karina's information led to another disturbing discovery. Daniel had been working on a project at the company that seemed to have gotten him into trouble. According to Karina, he was obsessed with something related to his boss's financial records. He was talking about irregularities, money that didn't add up, and something he shouldn't have seen. That's when we started to connect the pieces. Daniel had found something he shouldn't have. He was scared, but not cautious enough to stay out of it. We decided to go to his workplace to look for more answers. At the office, we were greeted coldly. Daniel's boss, a middle-aged man with an unflappable countenance, claimed he knew nothing about his disappearance. According to him, Daniel had been behaving erratically over the past few days and had requested a couple of days off just before he disappeared. While we were there, I noticed that some employees avoided our eye contact. One woman, whose name I don't remember, subtly let slip that Daniel had been inquiring about certain financial movements involving significant amounts of money. Someone else remarked that he had once been seen arguing heatedly with his boss in a closed boardroom. Everything pointed to Daniel having discovered something bigger than he could handle. However, we had no concrete proof and no clear path to follow. The feeling of helplessness was suffocating. Days turned into weeks. The police finally began to take his disappearance seriously, but seemed to make no progress in the investigation. Meanwhile, we kept finding loose pieces of his life that made us doubt how much we really knew him. In his bank account, we discovered recent movements that did not make sense. Large cash withdrawals had been made on consecutive days prior to his disappearance. The total sum was enough to make us think he was paying something or someone. Finally, I decided to return to his apartment once again. Something was bothering me, a feeling that I had missed something important. I checked every nook and cranny, every drawer, every dark corner. It was in the closet that I found a small metal box hidden under a false bottom. Inside the box were documents, photos, and a flash drive. The documents were copies of contracts and financial transactions that appeared to incriminate his boss in a money laundering scheme. The photos showed clandestine meetings in restaurants and offices. Some included Daniel, others men he did not recognize. The contents of the flash drive were what struck me the most. There were audio files where Daniel spoke, probably recordings made with his phone. In them, you could hear his voice, nervous but determined, detailing what he had discovered. At one point, he mentioned that someone had threatened him, that he was being followed. I understood then that Daniel had not disappeared of his own free will. Someone had decided to silence him. I took everything to the police, but I felt they were not doing enough. Days passed, and the lack of answers became unbearable. I started to think about taking matters into my own hands, but I didn't know where to start. One day on my way home, I noticed a car parked nearby. There was something strange about it, as if it had been there longer than it should have been. As I walked past it, I saw a man inside, looking straight at me. That night, I felt watched. I began to understand what Daniel must have felt in his last days. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't concentrate. Paranoia grew inside me like a shadow I could not ignore. Although I never met Daniel, I learned more than I would have liked to know about his life. I discovered that my brother was braver and more reckless than I imagined. He had faced something dangerous, something that ended up consuming him. Every time it rains, I go back to that afternoon, to that moment when I saw him walk out the door. If I had known it would be the last time, I would have asked him where he was going. I would have asked him to stay. But I didn't, and now all I'm left with is an emptiness I can never fill. The first letter arrived early one Monday morning. It was a plain white envelope with no return address, with my name written in capital letters and perfectly aligned. At first, I didn't think anything of it. I thought it was some kind of advertisement or a generic invitation. When I opened it, I found a carefully folded sheet of paper. In the center, in neat handwriting, was a message that read, "I know who you really are." I did not understand the meaning of those words. It was such an ambiguous phrase that could be interpreted in many ways. I left it on the table and went on with my day, but there was something about the way it was written that made me uneasy. An uneasy feeling began to brew inside me, though I tried to ignore it. During the week, nothing out of the ordinary happened, but I couldn't help but look over my shoulder every time I left the house. I didn't consider myself a paranoid person, but the idea that someone might be watching me was disturbing. The following Monday, another letter arrived. This time the message was more direct. "I've been seeing you. I wonder how much more you can hide." I began to worry. Hide what? My life was pretty ordinary. I worked in an office, lived alone in a small apartment, and my daily routine was not particularly exciting. However, the idea that someone was spying on me cast a shadow of uncertainty over every aspect of my life. I decided not to discuss anything with anyone. I thought maybe it was a practical joke or some kind of mix-up. But when the third letter arrived, I knew this was no mistake. In it, the sender mentioned specific details of my life, things that no one else should know. It said what time I left home, what route I took to get to work, and how I always sat at the same table in my favorite coffee shop. Fear became a constant tightness in my chest. That same night, I checked every corner of my apartment for hidden cameras or microphones. I found nothing. I closed all the windows and secured the door with a double turn of the key, but I couldn't sleep. The fourth letter arrived the next day. This time it included a photograph. It was a picture taken from a distance, showing me entering my work building. The angle was such that the photographer must have been watching me from across the street. At the bottom of the photo, he had written, "I'm always close by." From that moment on, every aspect of my life became a scenario of uncertainty. I would walk down the street looking at every person as if they might be my stalker. Every time I heard a noise in my building, I would stand still, waiting to hear something else. My privacy, something I had always taken for granted, had crumbled. I tried to remember if I had done something that might have provoked this. Maybe I had offended someone without realizing it. Or maybe I was the target of some kind of revenge. I thought about coworkers, neighbors, and even friends, but I couldn't think of anyone who might have a motive to harass me in this way. After the sixth letter, I decided to act. I took all the notes to the police, but their response was disappointing. They said that, without an explicit threat or concrete evidence of imminent danger, they couldn't do much more than take my statement. Helplessness clung to me like a second skin. I decided to take matters into my own hands. I began to keep an eye on my surroundings, noting anything that seemed suspicious. Every time I left home, I changed my route and took unexpected detours, trying to catch the sender in the act. But it was no use. It seemed that whoever it was knew exactly how to stay hidden. One day, while going through the mail in my building's mailbox, I found another letter. This one was not inside the mailbox, but taped to the back of the door. The message was brief, but blunt. "Don't waste your time. You can't hide from me." That night, when I returned home, I noticed that something was out of place. The door was locked, but the lock seemed to have fresh marks on it, as if someone had tried to open it. I entered cautiously, checking each room. Nothing appeared to have been stolen, but there was one disturbing detail in my living room. On the table was a framed photograph that had previously been on a shelf. It was a picture of my family at a reunion, but now someone had added a note to the frame. "Nice memories, don't you think?" My mind went into a state of high alert. Not only was I being watched, but they had also been inside my house. I decided to investigate on my own. I checked the names of contacts on my phone and social networks for any connections that might seem suspicious. I began to take a closer look at the people I worked with and the neighbors in my building. I began to notice small details that I would have overlooked before, like the man who always seemed to be sitting on the same bench near my office, or the delivery man who looked too long when delivering packages to my building. My obsession with finding the sender of the letters began to consume every aspect of my life. I couldn't concentrate on work, and my personal relationships deteriorated. My world was reduced to my apartment and the streets I roamed trying to figure out who was behind it all. Finally, the letter arrived that changed everything. This one did not contain a message, but a key. I didn't recognize what it might belong to, but attached to it was a piece of paper with an address written on it. I went to the right place. It was a motel on the outskirts of the city, a gloomy and decadent-looking place. I hesitated before entering, but curiosity and the desire for answers were stronger than my fear. The key corresponded to one of the rooms. I opened the door with trembling hands and found a dark and poorly lit space. There was an unmade bed, a table full of papers, and a wall covered with photographs. The images were all of me. Some were recent, but others looked years old. There were pictures of me in college, at family gatherings, and at places I barely remembered visiting. There were also newspaper clippings about events I had been involved in, and handwritten notes with details of my daily life. At that moment, I understood. This was not a recent thing. Whoever was behind this had been watching me for years. As I was looking through the photographs, I noticed one that I didn't immediately recognize. It was an image of a group of people, probably taken at a work event. There I was, along with other colleagues, but what caught my attention was a face in the background. A man who looked familiar, although I couldn't place him. I returned home with my mind in a whirl. That night, as I was trying to organize my thoughts, a message came on my phone. It was an unknown number, but the content was clear. "You're finally catching on. I don't know who he is or what he wants, but I have come to accept a frightening truth. My life is no longer mine, and maybe it never was. Someone has been there, in the shadows, controlling my every step, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal himself. And the worst part is that I don't know if I'll ever be able to escape." The day my life changed forever, the weather seemed to foreshadow it. It was cold, and the sky was covered with clouds so thick you could barely make out the sun. It was oppressively dark, the kind of atmosphere that makes everything feel heavier. I arrived at the office a little before 8 o'clock as usual, with a coffee in one hand and my briefcase in the other. I had gotten used to my routine. It wasn't exciting, but it was steady, or so I thought. The first sign that something was wrong came at noon when I was called into the boardroom. I had never been called to an emergency meeting before, let alone with management. The tension in the air was palpable from the moment I walked through the door. There stood the general manager, the head of security, and a couple of people from the finance area. Their gazes were stern, evaluating. They didn't give me many explanations, but they made it clear that something serious had happened. A theft of major proportions. A sum of millions had disappeared from the company's accounts, and all the evidence, they said, pointed to me. My first reaction was to laugh, a nervous guffaw that didn't fit the tone of the meeting. I thought it must be a misunderstanding, a glitch in the system, or even a practical joke. But then they started showing me proof. Transactions made from my computer, documents signed with my name, and access to the financial systems at times that coincided with the days I was in the office. I tried to defend myself, but my words sounded weak even to me. The evidence was overwhelming, and the scariest part was that I had no idea how they had gotten there. I had never entered into such transactions or authorized anything like it. I left the meeting with a mixture of disbelief and anger. I couldn't believe I was being accused of something so serious. As I walked down the hallway, I felt the stares of my peers on me, whispers that stopped just as I passed. In a matter of hours, my reputation had crumbled. That night, as I tried to organize my thoughts, I went through every email, every file on my computer, looking for something that might prove my innocence. All I found was a void. My computer was clean, almost too clean. It was as if someone had carefully erased any trace of their tampering, leaving only the evidence that incriminated me. The next day, I decided to confront the situation directly. I spoke to the head of security and asked for access to the surveillance camera recordings. I wanted to prove that I had not been in front of my computer during the key moments. However, I was told that the cameras in my section had been out of service during the weekend when the transactions took place. It was too much of a coincidence. Little by little, I began to notice little details that didn't fit. People who were once friendly now avoided looking me in the eye. My boss, a man I had respected for years, began to distance himself, as if he knew something I did not. It was then that I decided to investigate on my own. I started to check the names on the documents I had supposedly signed and the accounts to which the money had been transferred. I discovered that several of those accounts belonged to fictitious companies, recently created. But there was one detail that caught my attention. One of the names was related to a supplier with whom our company had had problems in the past. I remembered that a year ago, that supplier had been fired after an audit revealed irregularities in its contracts. One of the managers, a man named Salinas, had been in charge of that operation. I remembered this because at the time there had been rumors that Salinas was also involved in those contracts, but nothing was ever proven. I decided to follow that trail. I asked discreet questions, trying not to arouse suspicion. I learned that Salinas had been traveling frequently in recent months, and that, curiously, each of his trips coincided with important meetings where decisions related to the missing money were made. I became more and more convinced that someone inside the company had organized the theft, and I was just a scapegoat. But proving it would not be easy. I needed proof, and time was not on my side. The company had already filed a formal complaint, and the police would soon be involved. One night, while going through the files at home, I found something that changed everything. It was an old email, one that I had overlooked. In it, a colleague was asking me to sign a document related to an upgrade in financial systems. I remembered signing it without giving it much thought. It was standard procedure. But now, reading it again, I noticed that the document included a clause giving remote access to my computer. I didn't know how to prove that I had been duped, but at least now I had a clue. I decided to confront my colleague the next day, a man named Ortega. Ortega was reserved, the kind of person who never said more than necessary. When I mentioned the document to him, his face changed subtly. He didn't say much, but his discomfort was evident. Later that night, I received an anonymous phone call. A distorted voice warned me to stop asking questions if I valued my safety. I didn't know whether to take it seriously, but the threat was clear. Nevertheless, I did not stop. I went further and checked Ortega's connections with Salinas. I discovered that they had worked together in another company before coming here, and that financial problems had been reported there as well. Everything pointed to the fact that they had been orchestrating this from the beginning. One night, while I was still investigating, I noticed that my door was slightly open. I entered cautiously and discovered that someone had been in my house. My papers were in disarray, and my computer had been tampered with. It was then that I realized the magnitude of the danger I was in. I decided to keep copies of everything I had found and give them to a lawyer. I knew I could not face this alone. When I presented the evidence, the company finally started investigating other employees. What followed was a slow and wearing process, but in the end, the truth came out. Salinas and Ortega had been working together, using my access as a cover to divert the money. They were arrested, but the damage to my life had already been done. Although my innocence was proven, I was never the same. The cold and darkness of that day never quite left me, as a reminder of how fragile trust can be and how quickly it can all crumble. It all began as stories that promised to change your life begin with a chance that seemed written by destiny. It was an April afternoon, in a cafe I never used to go to. She was there, sitting by the window, with a book in her hands and a look that seemed not to belong to the world around her. I was struck by her serenity, the way she seemed oblivious to the hustle and bustle. Her name was Elena. In the first encounters, everything about her was an enveloping mystery. There was a natural elegance in her movements and a peculiar way of choosing words. Her laughter was contagious, but not forced, as if it was reserved only for the moments when she really felt it. There was something magnetic about her, something that grabbed me from the start. Our relationship progressed rapidly, almost as if we had met in another life. Before long, his presence became an indispensable part of my routine. We would spend endless afternoons talking about books, music, and trips we dreamed of taking together. I was fascinated by his intelligence, his passion for detail, and the way he always seemed to know exactly what to say. But as time progressed, small cracks began to appear in its perfect facade. It wasn't something I could clearly point to, but rather an accumulation of odd moments. Sometimes, when he thought he wasn't looking at her, his expression would change. Her gaze would become distant, cold, as if she were trapped in a memory she would rather forget. One night, while we were cooking together, I mentioned the possibility of visiting her family. It was as if I flipped a switch. His face tightened, and although he tried to hide it, he couldn't help a slight tremor in his hands. He said that his relationship with them was complicated and changed the subject so quickly that I was left with the feeling that I had touched on a forbidden topic. I did not insist, at least not at that moment, but curiosity began to grow. Something about her reaction had made me uneasy. That night, as she slept next to me, I went through her purse. It was an invasion of her privacy, I know, but the uneasiness had begun to eat away at me. I found an old ID, an address in a city he had never mentioned, and a different last name than the one he had given me. I didn't know what to do with that information, so I tucked it away in the darkest corner of my mind, hoping it was just a coincidence, something that could be easily explained if I dared to ask. But I didn't. Instead, I began to watch her more closely. Sometimes I would receive calls that he would not answer in front of me. Other times, he would disappear for hours and return with vague explanations that didn't quite fit. When I asked him where he had been, he would respond with a calm smile that only increased my doubts. One afternoon, I decided to investigate the address I had found on her ID. It was an old house, located in a neighborhood that seemed to have seen better days. I knocked on the door, but no one answered. As I walked away, a neighbor stopped me and asked who I was looking for. When I gave her Elena's name, her expression changed. She told me that she didn't know anyone by that name, but that years ago, a woman matching her description had lived there. The woman had disappeared overnight, leaving behind rumors of a life full of secrets. That night, I confronted Elena. I asked her for the address and the different name on her ID. Her reaction was puzzled. Instead of denying it, she simply looked at me with a mixture of sadness and resignation. She said there were things from her past that she couldn't share, that she wasn't ready to talk about. She promised that she had nothing to fear, but her words failed to calm me. The days that followed were marked by constant tension. I felt like there was an invisible wall between us, a barrier that I couldn't break through without jeopardizing our relationship. But then something happened that changed everything. One day, while Elena was out, I received an envelope with no return address. Inside were a series of newspaper clippings and photographs. The headlines told of a man who had been found dead under suspicious circumstances. The photographs were disturbing. In one of them, taken in the back of a cafe, Elena was sitting next to the man. Fear settled in my chest like an unbearable weight. I could not ignore the evidence, but neither could I confront her directly without knowing more. I decided to look for information about the case. According to the files I found on the internet, the man had been a businessman involved in several financial scandals. His death had been officially declared a suicide, but many suspected that he had been murdered. With each new detail, Elena's profile grew darker. I began to wonder if the woman I had fallen in love with was just a carefully constructed facade. My feelings were torn between the love I still felt for her and the terror of what she might discover. Finally, on the day I discovered it all, it was raining. The rain was coming down hard, pounding on the windows as if the sky was trying to warn me of what was to come. That afternoon, Elena came out saying she had a meeting, but I knew she was lying. I followed her to a hotel on the outskirts of town. From my car, I saw her enter the building and meet with a man I didn't recognize. Their gestures were tense, as if they were discussing something important. After a few minutes, she pulled out an envelope and handed it to him. The man took it gingerly and left quickly. When she returned home that night, I confronted her. I told her that I knew she had lied to me, that I knew about her connection to the dead businessman. For the first time, I saw fear in her eyes. She didn't try to explain or deny it. Instead, she asked me to listen to her, to give her a chance to explain everything. She said that she had done things she was not proud of, but that it had all been out of necessity. She claimed that the businessman was a dangerous man who had ruined many people's lives, including her own. She didn't tell me all the details, but she hinted that she had been involved in something that had gotten out of control, something that was now haunting her. I don't know if I believed her, but at that moment I decided that I couldn't go on with her anymore. That night, while I was sleeping, I packed my things and left. I didn't leave a note or an explanation. I knew that if I stayed, I would never be safe. Since then, I have changed my number, address, and even my job. Sometimes, on rainy nights, I wonder if I will ever see her again. I don't know if she was a victim or a villain, but I do know that playing with fire never leaves anyone unscathed. The rain had been falling steadily for hours, beating on the windshield of my car like a constant drum that reminded me how far I was from my destination. The trip was an idea I had had weeks ago, a way to disconnect from everything and find myself again. But the bad weather, coupled with a GPS error, had turned what should have been a smooth drive into a nightmare. The road I was on was increasingly narrow and poorly lit. The trees on both sides of the road loomed like imposing shadows, their branches dripping water that the wind pushed against the car. I clung to the steering wheel, trying not to despair. The map on my phone was no longer charging, and no other vehicles had passed in at least an hour. It was then that I saw the sign. It was a rusty sign, leaning to one side from the weight of years, with barely legible letters, "Welcome to San Andres." The name told me nothing, but my gas tank was dangerously low, and I thought maybe I could find a station to refuel and ask how to get back on the right road. The entrance to the town was discreet, almost as if it wanted to go unnoticed. The streets were empty, which was not so strange considering the downpour, but the lack of movement made me nervous. The architecture of the place seemed anchored in time, with weathered wooden houses and signs advertising stores that looked like they had closed decades ago. I continued walking until I found what appeared to be a central plaza. There was a small cafe with the lights on, and a woman behind the counter who looked at me curiously as I entered. The place smelled of freshly brewed coffee and something sweet, probably cake. I ordered a coffee and tried to ask about a nearby gas station, but before I could finish my question, an older man sitting at a table interrupted me, pointing out that he could help me. He was kind, perhaps too kind. His smile was wide, but his eyes seemed to evaluate me. He explained that there was no gas station in town, but that he had a jerry can in his house that he could sell me. I had no choice, so I took him up on his offer. He led me down a side street, his boots sloshing in puddles as I followed him carefully. His house was one of the largest I had seen in town, though just as dilapidated as the rest. The interior was dark and smelled musty. He asked me to wait in the living room while he looked for the jerry can. The room was decorated with old photos, most of them in black and white. What caught my attention was that in all the pictures the people had the same expression, a smile that seemed more forced than natural. There was something unsettling in the uniformity of those smiles. When he returned, he handed me the jerry can and offered to take me back to my car. We walked in silence to the plaza, and although I was grateful for his help, I couldn't help but shiver as he shook my hand before saying goodbye. His smile remained fixed, as if etched on his face. I went back to the car and filled up the tank, determined to get out of that place as quickly as possible. However, when I tried to start the engine, it wouldn't start. I checked several times, but everything seemed to be in order. The problem made no sense. I returned to the cafe to ask for help, but the woman was gone. The door was closed, although the lights were still on. I knocked on the glass several times, but got no response. It was then that I realized that someone was watching me from the other side of the square. It was a young man, standing in the rain, motionless. I approached to talk to him, but before I could get to him, he turned and started walking. I followed him, thinking maybe he could help me. He walked down several streets until he came to a building that appeared to be some sort of community center. The door was ajar, and although I hesitated for a moment, curiosity got the better of me. The interior of the building was cold and dark. A long hallway led to a larger room, where several people were gathered in silence. There was something ritualistic about the arrangement of chairs and the way everyone seemed to be waiting for something. As they saw me, their faces turned in unison, and once again I saw those smiles, identical to those in the photos in the house of the man who had helped me. I felt a wave of discomfort and slowly backed away. One of them, a man in an old hat and long coat, started walking toward me. My instincts told me not to wait to see what he wanted, so I ran out of there. I returned to the car, soaking wet and with my heart racing. I was determined to try to start it one more time, but then I saw something that froze me. Through the windshield, in the rain, the same people from the community center were now standing in the square, looking at me. I frantically started the car, turning the key until finally the engine roared. Without looking back, I sped down the main street, looking for the way out of town. But every street I took seemed to lead back to the center. It was as if I was trapped in a maze. After what seemed like hours, I found a path I didn't remember seeing before. Without thinking, I took it. The road was bumpy and looked like it hadn't been used in years, but I pressed on, convinced that any direction was better than staying. Finally, I saw lights in the distance, but they were not those of another town or city. It was a pair of headlights coming straight at me. I had to swerve quickly to avoid the collision, and my car ended up going off the road, crashing into a tree. When I woke up, I was back in the town square. The rain had stopped, but my car was gone. The same people as before were there, looking at me. This time they were not smiling. Something had changed in their expressions, something that I could not understand, but that filled me with an indescribable terror. I tried to speak, to explain that I just wanted to leave, but none of them responded. They just slowly circled around me, closing the circle around me. I don't know how much time passed. The next thing I remember is waking up in a hospital with minor injuries and a police officer by my side. He told me that I had been found miles from town, walking alone on the road. My car never showed up, and when I mentioned San Andres, he looked at me with confusion. There was no town by that name in the area. Since then, I have tried to look for information, but there is no record of San Andres on any map. Sometimes, on rainy nights, I close my eyes and I can see them, with their identical smiles and empty eyes, waiting for me to return. I had always considered Peter my brother. We met in college, and from then on we were inseparable. There was something about his charisma that made you want to be around him. A mix of confidence and casualness that seemed to open doors for him wherever he went. He was the kind of guy who could turn the most mundane situation into something memorable. I admired him, even envied him at times. But I never doubted him. At least, not until everything started to fall apart. The first indication that something wasn't right came one night when I received a strange email. It was from an unknown address, and the subject line read, "Do you really know Peter?" At first I thought it was spam, but curiosity got the better of me. The message was brief, just a link and a warning that I should be careful who I trusted. Against my better judgment, I opened the link. It took me to an anonymous forum where someone had shared information about a series of financial scams. The details were vague, but Peter's name appeared several times. There were screenshots of messages, bank statements, and a list of people supposedly affected. I couldn't believe it. I spent the night trying to rationalize what I had seen, Maybe it was a mistake, a confusion of identities, or maybe someone was trying to frame him. But something inside me kept whispering that I needed to investigate further. I spent the next few days watching him more closely. I began to notice things I had previously ignored. Peter spent long hours on calls, always left the room when his phone rang, and avoided answering direct questions about his work. When I mentioned the mail, he took it lightly, laughing and saying it was probably a bad joke. But his laughter didn't reach his eyes. Mistrust grew on me like a shadow. One afternoon, while Peter was in the shower, I checked his computer. What I found confirmed my worst suspicions. There were emails with instructions for suspicious bank transfers, lists of accounts with names I didn't recognize, and documents that looked like contracts, but with terms I found murky. It was a world to which I did not belong, and yet it seemed to be involving me in some way. I decided to confront him that same night. We met at our usual bar, a quiet place where we used to talk about anything. But this time, the conversation didn't flow as usual. When I asked him directly about what he had found, his expression changed. His smile disappeared, and for an instant, I saw something I had never seen in him before. Fear. He denied everything, of course. He said there was an explanation for everything, that I was misunderstanding things. But the more he talked, the more evasive he became. Finally, he stood up abruptly, saying he didn't have to listen to absurd accusations. He left me alone, with an empty feeling in my chest and a knot in my stomach. The next morning, I received a call from the bank. Someone had tried to access my account using my credentials. Fortunately, the transaction was blocked, but the incident alarmed me. Then, while checking my mail, I found another anonymous message. This time, it contained an audio recording. I recognized Peter's voice instantly. He was talking to someone about how to handle a problem that sounded like me. Fear turned into paranoia. I felt I couldn't trust anyone, not even my shadow. I decided to take a few days off work and try to find out what was really going on. I hired a private investigator, an older man with an air of experience that inspired confidence in me. I gave him all the information I had, including the forum, the emails, and the recording. What he discovered was much worse than he imagined. Peter was involved in a money laundering ring operating under the guise of a financial consulting firm. His work, at least on the surface, appeared legitimate, but in reality, he was using the company's resources to funnel money into offshore accounts. There was also evidence that several of its contacts had disappeared under suspicious circumstances. The revelation stunned me. Not only was I dealing with a traitor, but someone who was clearly dangerous. I felt like I was walking on a minefield, each step more uncertain than the last. One day as I was returning home, I noticed a car following me. I sped up, turned on random streets, trying to throw it off, but the vehicle was still there. Finally, I stopped at a nearby police station. When I got out, the car was gone. That night, someone picked the lock to my apartment. They didn't take anything, but they made it clear that they could come in whenever they wanted. I knew it was a message, a warning that I should stop poking around where I didn't belong. I called Peter. I asked him to meet me, to talk to me like adults. He said he would agree, but only if we met in a public place. He arranged to meet me in a park at sunset, a place we used to visit when we wanted to disconnect from everything. When I arrived, he was already there. He seemed calmer than I expected, almost as if he was enjoying the situation. He told me that he had made mistakes, but that everything he did was for a good cause. He claimed that he had no choice, that he was caught up in something much bigger than himself. I did not believe him. His tone was too cold, too calculated. I felt he was measuring my reactions, waiting for me to make a mistake. When I told him I knew about the money laundering ring, his expression hardened. He warned me that I should be careful, that I was playing with forces I could not understand. Before he left me with one last warning. If I went ahead, I would not only put my life at risk, but also the lives of the people I cared about. It was a veiled threat, but an effective one. Since then, my life has been in chaos. I've changed my phone number, moved to another state, and stopped having contact with anyone who could link me to Peter. But even with all that distance, the fear persists. Sometimes in the darkest nights, I wonder if I can ever feel safe again. Because, even though I'm no longer near him, the net he built is still there, invisible but relentless, waiting for the right moment to catch me. When I first saw the message, I thought it was a joke. My phone vibrated in the middle of the early morning, a dull sound that brought me out of a light sleep. It was raining. The rain was pounding hard on the window panes, and a steady murmur filled the air. I looked at the screen of my cell phone, dimly lit by the faint streetlight coming through the crack in the curtain. The message came from an unknown number. You have 24 hours to solve the mystery, otherwise someone close to you will pay the consequences. The countdown has begun. My first thought was that it was some kind of spam, or perhaps the wrong message, but something in the tone, in the brevity of the words, made me feel a strange discomfort. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something urgent, something behind that message that I couldn't understand. I ignored it at first, giving it little importance. At that moment, I just wanted to sleep and not think about it anymore. However, the rest of the night faded into a spiral of sleeplessness. The rain kept falling, and every time I closed my eyes, I felt a pressure in my chest, as if time was moving faster than I could bear. I felt something watching me, though I couldn't see anything. The message kept circling in my mind, in a constant spiral of dark thoughts. The next morning, I tried to ignore the strange feeling the endless rain left me with. The day had started with the same persistent humidity, as if the falling water never wanted to stop. I decided to go to work, hoping it was all a blur. I thought the message would be forgotten, that everything would go back to normal. But it wasn't. When I got to the office, my phone vibrated again. This time, the message was different, clearer. You are wasting time. Only you can prevent what will happen. Solve the mystery before it's too late. The pressure in my chest increased. Something about the way the message was written made me think I wasn't just playing a joke. It was as if someone really knew things about me, as if they were watching my every move. I felt a cold sweat run down my back, and for a moment, the air in the office became thick, as if the humidity coming from the storm had invaded the enclosed space as well. I tried to concentrate on my work, on routine tasks, but it was impossible. The storm did not stop, and every time I looked at my phone, I expected another message. It was hard to think of anything else, and the worst thing was that I felt a growing sense of despair. I looked at my watch, knowing that the hours were slipping away. There was only one day left, 24 hours, and I had no idea what the riddle I had to solve was all about. I decided to call my sister Susan. She was the closest person to me, and in the message, they didn't even mention who might be in danger, but something told me she might be involved. She answered on the second ring, and although our conversation was brief, I tried to hide the nervousness in my voice. "Are you all right?" I asked, trying to sound as normal as possible. Susan told me that everything was fine, that there was nothing to worry about, but something in her tone made me suspect that she was also feeling something strange. Somehow the storm seemed to have affected the atmosphere, leaving an uneasy feeling in the air, even over the phone. Hours passed, and the message kept coming. Each time, with more urgency. Each time, with more disturbing details that revealed things I shouldn't know. There were mentions of meetings I'd had that week, conversations I'd had with Susan, even little decisions I'd made the day before. As the day progressed, the rain did not stop. Every drop that fell seemed to mark another second in the countdown. There were no answers, only questions that grew as I tried to decipher the riddle. The message was no longer just a text on my phone. It had invaded every corner of my mind, and now everything I saw seemed like a clue, a sign of something I couldn't understand. The storm intensified in the afternoon, and the city descended into chaos. Traffic came to a standstill, streets flooded, and lights flickered intermittently. I decided to go home before the situation worsened. I couldn't stand still. waiting for the riddle to solve itself. I had to act. When I arrived at my apartment, the phone vibrated again. This time the message was shorter, but much more direct. I'm watching you. You have 12 hours. If you don't solve the riddle, someone close to you will pay the price. A sense of dread came over me. Something was going on, and I couldn't figure out what. My mind began to work a mile a minute, running through every possible clue, every conversation, every encounter of the last few days. Who could be behind all this? What riddle was I supposed to solve? Suddenly, something in my memory was triggered. I remembered a conversation I had had with an old friend, Javier, weeks ago. We talked about an old project we had both left behind, one that had been aborted because of a mistake I had made. At the time, it seemed to me that Javier was worried, that something was bothering him, but I didn't think much of it. Now, that conversation seemed much more relevant to me. I decided to go see him, even though I knew the clock was ticking. The rain continued to fall relentlessly, and each drop seemed to mark one more step into darkness. I arrived at his house, and when I knocked on the door, a strange feeling came over me. There was something in the air, a tension that could be cut with a knife. The door opened slowly, and Javier was there, with a serious expression. What happened next was a whirlwind of events that happened too fast. Javier stared at me, and without a word, led me into his living room. The television was on, but it showed no pictures, just a low hum. "I was waiting for you," he said without looking at me. Before he could ask her what was going on, his phone rang. He looked at it with concern, and suddenly the message he had been receiving all day appeared on the screen of his device. It was the same message, but now with a name. My sister. Javier looked at me for the first time, and in his eyes I saw something I had never seen before. Fear. "I'm sorry," he muttered. I didn't know how to stop it. Suddenly, everything began to fall into place. Javier had been the target of the riddle, and he had involved my sister in his mistake. Apparently, he was caught up in something much bigger than himself, something that had gotten out of hand. He had used my trust, our friendship, to entangle me in his own web of lies. The countdown ended when the rain finally stopped, but not before my life was irrevocably altered. It was one of those days when the sun sets early, and the road seems to stretch endlessly under a rapidly darkening sky. I was driving alone, something I had always loved, enjoying the solitude on the vast expanse of the road. I had long since left the city behind, and was passing through a rural area where houses were sparse and trees dominated the landscape. The radio, turned off for a while, only let the sound of the tires on the asphalt fill the silence. Everything seemed normal, even reassuring, until I passed him. He was standing on the side of the road, with a backpack over his shoulders, looking at the traffic with a somewhat lost expression, but not conveying anything particularly worrisome. I hadn't expected to find a hitchhiker in the middle of nowhere, but at first I didn't think much of it. My road was long and I didn't want to waste time, but something made me slow down. Perhaps loneliness, or maybe curiosity. I stopped the car beside him. I watched the young man carefully as he approached the vehicle. He was tall, with a scruffy beard, and although his clothes were somewhat dirty, he did not appear to be in dire need. He had a wary look on his face, as if he was assessing whether my car was safe to get into. Finally, without saying a word, he opened the passenger door and settled in. I'm not one to converse with strangers, but the trip would be long, and my friendly nature led me to break the silence. I asked him if he was headed somewhere in particular, but all he did was nod. He didn't seem to be in a hurry, which struck me as odd. Maybe he was tired, or didn't know what to expect. Throughout the first few minutes, conversation was limited. He responded in a brief, monosyllabic manner, almost as if he didn't want to be bothered. I decided then that it would be best to turn on the radio to make the ride less uncomfortable. It was after a couple of songs, as the rain began to fall in fine drops that slid down the windshield, that the young man began to speak. He did so without any warning, as if he had been waiting for the right moment. He told me his name was Johnny, and that he was traveling across the country for personal reasons. His tone of voice was calm, but there was something in his words that made me pay attention to him. He mentioned that it wasn't the first time he had made a trip like that sometimes he felt like he was running from something, although he couldn't pinpoint exactly what. My first impression was that he was someone who simply had no clear direction, someone who was not looking for a specific purpose. But then he started talking about something darker. Suddenly, almost casually, he mentioned that there was something strange about the people he had met in his travels. He had begun to notice that everywhere he had been, there were always disturbing occurrences, something unsettling that he could never fully understand. As he continued, his tone became lower, almost as if he were sharing a secret. He told me that in a small town he was in recently, something strange happened. It was an out-of-the-way town, without much to offer, but always full of life, friendly, cordial people. However, on one particularly dark night, he witnessed something that left a mark on him. He spoke of a man who seemed overly interested in his arrival. He followed him through the streets, approached him when he stopped at a store, and asked him questions about his journey. What made him uncomfortable was the insistence with which this man talked about his life, about what he did, as if he already knew him, as if he knew more about him than a stranger might. The worst came later. During that same night, while John was trying to rest in a hotel, something woke him up. A noise, a strange feeling. He thought maybe someone was trying to get into his room, but when he looked out the window, all he saw was a group of people moving through the streets, like shadows, making no noise, as if they were waiting for something. John tried to rationalize what he saw, but there was something in his eyes, something that said he didn't want to know anymore. What followed was worse. The next day, when John left to continue his trip, he realized that something strange had happened to his car. The tires were flat, and someone had left a note on the windshield. The note had no words, just a strange drawing, some kind of symbol that he couldn't understand. He decided to leave quickly, but the feeling of being watched never left him. The people of the town seemed unmoved, as if nothing had happened. I listened to him in silence, not knowing what to think. My mind was trying to understand what he was saying, but something didn't fit. The young man seemed sincere, although each word seemed to carry more weight than the last. I tried to change the subject, but he wouldn't stop talking, as if he needed to get it all out, and then abruptly he paused. He looked out the window, watching the raindrops sliding down the glass, and added something that made my blood run cold. He told me that what terrified him most was not the strange occurrences that had happened to him in his travels, but the feeling that there was something much bigger, something that was watching him every moment, something that was lurking, waiting. He said he had come to the conclusion that he could not run away. Somehow that something was following him, no matter how many miles he traveled, how many towns he left behind. His voice trailed off for a moment, and the tension that had built up during his story was palpable. As he spoke, something in me began to tense up. The rain intensified, and the road seemed darker. The lights of oncoming cars illuminated the road with a fleeting glimmer, but I felt as if we were alone in a void, surrounded by an invisible fog. At first, I tried to shake off the feeling of discomfort, but I couldn't. There was something about John's story that didn't quite fit. Something that made me wonder if he was just a disturbed young man, or if there was something more sinister behind it all. Somehow, I felt involved. The atmosphere of tension that had built up between us was too thick, and as much as I tried to relax it, John's words kept echoing in my mind. In a moment, the conversation fell silent. There was only the sound of tires on wet asphalt and the steady patter of rain. I couldn't help but glance sideways at John, wondering if there was something he wasn't telling me. His face seemed absent, as if he was looking at something beyond the window, something I couldn't see. That's when I saw it. In the distance, on the road, there was a figure. I couldn't quite make it out, but it looked like a person. And strangely, he was walking in our direction, without a single gesture. without haste, without fear, as if he knew exactly where he was going. Suddenly, it all made sense. The feeling of being watched, John's story, that figure on the road. My mind began to run in circles, looking for an explanation, but I couldn't find one. I looked at John, and his face had gone pale. He didn't say a word, but I knew I saw him. The figure came closer and closer, and with each step, I felt as if something was closing in around me. The figure disappeared in the rain, but that presence, that feeling of being watched, never left me. When the figure disappeared, John slowly turned to me. His face was more serious than ever. I looked at him and, for an instant, understood what he had been trying to say all along. John's story hadn't been about him alone. It was about me too. And in that moment, I knew that we were being watched by something much bigger than either of us could comprehend. It had been years since I had last set foot in my hometown. After leaving it behind, I sought my place in the world, far from memories, far from everything I knew. I decided that my life should follow another path, one where I didn't have to look back, didn't have to face the past I had left behind. But when I received the news that my mother had passed away, I was forced to return. The trip was long, almost endless. As soon as I arrived, the city greeted me with its fresh, heavy air, a climate that had not changed since I left. Despite all the time that had passed, everything was still the same. The same streets, the same stores, the same trees I had known in my childhood. But as I walked down the familiar streets, something inside me began to change. Memories, those I had kept deep in the back of my mind, began to emerge, as if they had never left, as if they were patiently waiting to be remembered. My mother had left the house empty for years, and as I entered, I was overcome with a sense of abandonment. Everything was covered with a layer of dust, as if time had passed without anything changing. The house was still the same. The old sofa in the living room, the dining table in the center, the walls that had seen so many laughs and tears. But as I walked through each room, something didn't feel right. Everything seemed familiar, but at the same time, distant. I began to put things in order, to empty drawers, to go through the papers my mother had left behind. Among them, I found an old box that had been left at the bottom of a closet. When I opened it, I discovered a series of photographs, letters and mementos from my childhood. Among them was a photo that made me pause. It was a picture from elementary school, a group photo in which I was in the center, surrounded by my classmates. But there was something odd about that picture, something that didn't fit. At the edge of the image, almost imperceptible, was a figure, a shadow that seemed to be watching us from a distance. I couldn't take my eyes off that shadow. It was as if it was waiting for me to recognize it, as if it was daring me to remember something I had forgotten. The feeling of discomfort enveloped me, but I tried not to make a big deal of it. I thought maybe it was just a coincidence or an effect of the light. However, that image remained in my mind throughout the night. The next day, I decided to tour the city. I walked the streets I once knew so well, but now everything looked different. The houses seemed older, more worn by time, as if the city had aged without my permission. As I walked, memories began to surface more strongly, but not all of them were pleasant. Some were blurry, as if someone had purposely erased them from my mind. I remember my mother always busy, always distant, but it never bothered me too much. I accepted it as a matter of course, as if it were part of life. My father, on the other hand, had been a man who was present, but also distant in his manner. There was something about his attitude that I never fully understood, but I always tried not to make a big deal out of it. Over time, however, I began to notice little things that didn't fit. Whispered conversations between them, fleeting gestures that made me wonder if there was something else behind their apparent indifference. As I was walking along, I found myself in front of the old school. It was the place where I had spent much of my childhood, but at that moment, I realized that I remembered nothing of my last years there. The faces of my classmates were vague, almost unrecognizable. There were only fragments of memories that faded with each step. However, as I looked around the building, a strange feeling ran through me. Something inside me told me that there was something important there, something I had to discover. I decided to go inside. The school doors were open, as if no one had bothered to close them. I walked through the empty corridors, with the feeling that the echoes of the old shouts and laughter were still echoing off the walls. When I reached the old classroom, the one that used to be my classroom, the door was ajar. As I entered, the air was heavy, as if everything that had happened there still hung in the air. It was then that I saw it. On one of the walls, almost hidden behind an old table, was a drawing. It was a child's drawing, one of those we used to do in elementary school, but there was something strange about it. It showed a figure that looked like a child, with a shadow bigger than him, a shadow that surrounded him and seemed to devour him. I didn't remember seeing that drawing before, but as I looked at it, something inside me stirred. The drawing reminded me of something that had remained hidden for years. I couldn't help myself. I felt the need to explore further, to unearth the memories I had tried to bury for so long. I went back to my mother's house and searched through the things I had left behind, looking for something, anything that would give me a clue. It was then that I found a letter I didn't recognize, written in a handwriting that was unfamiliar to me. The letter talked about an event that happened in my childhood, something my mother had tried to hide. It said that in one of the summers, something had happened at school, something that involved a classmate of mine. At first I couldn't understand what I was reading, but as I continued, the words began to make sense. My mother had tried to protect me from something, from an event that had irreversibly marked my life. I remember that, in that summer, I had had a friend, a boy who was different from the others. He was always alone. He never played with the other children. He was strange, but in a way I was attracted to his mystery. Often we played in the backyard of the school, where no one else dared to go. It was a secluded place, surrounded by old trees that barely let any light through. We would spend hours there, talking about things I didn't understand, but which intrigued me. One afternoon, in the middle of one of those games, my friend disappeared. He simply vanished. No one saw him go, and there was no trace of his presence. The adults searched everywhere, but never found him. What disturbed me most, however, was that after his disappearance, I began to remember strange things. Fragments of conversations I didn't understand, images of that secluded place at school that seemed fuzzy, but still gave me a sense of anguish. The next day, I decided to go to my friend's house, even though I knew it would be useless. As I expected, the house was empty. No one knew what had happened to him, and the memories of that summer faded quickly. I didn't think about him again until now, when everything started to fall into place. The shadow in the photo, the drawing at school, the letter from my mother. It was all connected. My friend had been part of something much bigger than I had imagined. Something my mother had tried to protect me from. Something that happened that summer and was still present in the city, waiting to be discovered. As the hours passed, the pieces of the puzzle began to come together. My return to the city had not been only because of my mother's death. Something had drawn me here, something I needed to discover. And when everything I had forgotten began to come to light, I knew I could not escape. The shadow of the past, that shadow that had been part of my life, was still there, waiting for me to face the truth. The city, which seemed so familiar, began to transform into a strange place. I no longer saw the same streets, the same buildings. Everything had changed, but at the same time, nothing had changed. And I, trapped in memories, knew that I could never escape the shadow that had been left behind. The neighborhood had always been quiet, too quiet. I lived on a residential street where the houses were identical. and people seemed to live in perfect harmony, greeting each other with a smile on the sidewalk, or commenting on the weather as they took out the garbage. There was something eerie about the calmness of that place, something that made me feel that everything was too good to be real. But I never thought that an event as innocent as a neighborhood party would make me discover the dark secrets that everyone was trying to hide. It was a warm summer night. The lights of the houses flickered faintly in the darkness, as if they wanted to attract attention, as if they were waiting for something. The invitation had arrived in the mail a week earlier, written in neat calligraphy and elegant letters. A welcome party organized by the neighbors to get to know each other better. Although the idea of socializing did not excite me, the thought of participating in something that seemed so normal and trivial made me decide to attend. I thought that perhaps, by doing so, I could finally feel more integrated into the neighborhood, more a part of that place that I had always considered more distant than my own home. The party was being held at the Miller's house, a family I knew little about, except that they lived 3 houses down from me. They had been the first to greet me when I moved in, and their behavior had always been friendly, almost overly cordial. Nothing to indicate that anything was amiss, nothing to make me suspect that night would change my life forever. When I arrived, the air was permeated with laughter and soft music, and the Miller courtyard was illuminated by strings of lights hanging from the trees, creating a cozy atmosphere. At first, I felt comfortable. People were friendly, adults were chatting with each other, and children were running around the yard. It was the kind of party one might expect in a suburban neighborhood, perfect in its superficiality. I made my way to the snack table trying to fit in, when something caught my eye. A man I didn't know was watching me from across the patio. His gaze was not inquisitive or curious. It was something darker, as if he was waiting for something to happen. I averted my gaze, but I couldn't help but feel a strange sensation. I thought maybe I was being paranoid, but that lingering gaze left me uneasy. As the night progressed, the party continued like any other. However, I began to notice strange details. Conversations seemed stilted, as if people were too eager to please, to hide something. The laughter sounded too loud, the words too perfect. And most disturbing of all, people avoided talking about personal matters. Whenever someone mentioned something too close to their private lives, the conversation faded or quickly drifted to something trivial, like the weather or vacation plans. I went to a corner, trying to figure out what was going on. I watched the neighbors, all smiling, all acting with an artificial cordiality. But then, something caught my attention. At the back of the garden, next to one of the walls of the house, there was a small group gathered. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but the posture of their bodies told me they were more focused than a social gathering should allow. I approached cautiously, trying not to draw attention to myself. But as I got closer, a sound froze me. It was a whisper, a murmur, and although I couldn't understand what they were saying, the feeling that something wasn't right intensified. Something moved in the shadows, and for an instant, I saw a woman among the group. Her face was partially illuminated by the dim light, but what I saw made me stop dead in my tracks. She had a frightened expression, as if she was caught up in a conversation she didn't want to continue. I tried to step back, but a middle-aged man, one of the neighbors with whom I had exchanged a few words earlier, approached me and greeted me too effusively. His demeanor was strange, too enthusiastic for someone who didn't know me well. His conversation began with empty words about food and the weather, but as he continued, his tone became sharper, more insistent. He spoke to me about the importance of maintaining a good relationship with the other neighbors, how we should all support each other in the community, and something in his gaze made me feel as if he was trying to gauge my reaction. Somehow the man led me to a more secluded area of the party, away from the hustle and bustle. As we walked, I could see other neighbors slipping into the corners of the house, their footsteps almost inaudible. At that moment, a feeling of claustrophobia enveloped me, as if the house had suddenly begun to close in on me. I looked around, searching for some way out, something that would allow me to escape from the feeling of being trapped in something I did not understand. It was then that I saw what I didn't want to see. In a corner, near one of the windows, there was a table with scattered documents. It was no ordinary table. It was full of papers with names and photos, all crossed out and marked with red circles. The names were unfamiliar to me, but the place where I saw them made my blood run cold. Some of the faces in the photos appeared to be people from the neighborhood, but the markings and circles indicated something else. There was something unsettling about how those faces blended with the memories of the party. Suddenly, I understood. Everything at the party began to make sense, even though I didn't want to accept it. The whispering, the furtive glances, the way the conversation was always changing course. It was all part of the same story. Everyone present was trying to hide something they couldn't leave out in the open. The secret was clear, though hard to believe. The neighbors, the ones who looked so perfect, so kind, were involved in a web of deceit, in a kind of fraud involving people who had been torn from their lives. I didn't know all the details, but what was clear was that there was a series of manipulations and deceptions involving everyone. Perhaps worst of all, each of the neighbors had been willing to seal a pact of silence in exchange for their own benefit. Each person in that party had something to lose if the truth came out. They had begun exchanging dark secrets, pacts with people outside the neighborhood, to maintain a facade of perfection. I quickly moved away from the document table, trying not to draw attention to myself. I wanted to get out of there, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I had discovered. Everyone at that party was lying, hiding a truth that could destroy them. My mind was beginning to overflow with thoughts I couldn't process. How many others in the neighborhood were involved? Was I in danger? Had they begun to involve me without my knowledge? The party continued, but I no longer saw the neighbors with the same eyes. The cordiality, the smiles, the kind gestures, all seemed fake, like a cover for something much darker. I headed for the door, feeling everyone's eyes on me, watching me, perhaps hoping that I too would join the pact, or perhaps fearful that I already knew the truth. When I left the house, the night enveloped me like a cold blanket. The air was thick, and the noise of the party was left behind, lost in the distance. That night, as I drove away from the neighborhood, I knew I could never look at my neighbors the same way again. They had a secret, and now I knew it too. Worst of all, as much as I wanted to escape that truth, I could never forget what I discovered at that party. The park was completely empty, except for the swing that was gently swaying in the wind. I had noticed it as I passed by. Something about it caught my attention, and I couldn't help but stop to look at it. It was an old swing, with the ropes a bit frayed and the metal paint worn by the years. What disturbed me most, however, was not the swing itself, but the way it was rocking, back and forth, as if someone was sitting on it, although there was no one in sight. I looked around. The park was empty. There were no children or adults. Only the sound of the wind moving the leaves and the rustle of tree branches filled the air, and that swing moving all by itself. It was a gray day. Rain had fallen for hours before the sky cleared a little, but the humidity lingered in the air. I was on my way home, walking aimlessly. I had no clear plan, just wandering, as I often did when things in my life became confusing. I lived in a city where stress accumulates like dust, and sometimes I needed to escape. The park, though not far from my house, had never particularly appealed to me. I was used to walking past it without stopping. Today, however, something was different. I stared at the swing for several minutes, wondering if the wind had caused it to move, or if something else was at play. I couldn't explain it. On most days, that park was a quiet, safe place, but something about the atmosphere today made me feel uneasy. Perhaps it was the absolute silence, or maybe the fact that despite being an open park, I had never seen anyone in all the time I had been there. My curiosity led me to get closer. Each step I took towards the swing seemed heavier than the previous one. as if the air was thicker, as if something was pushing me towards that place. I stopped a few meters away from the swing, and for a moment, I looked into the void, looking for some logical explanation. But there was none. There wasn't enough wind to move it that way, at least not enough to maintain that constant movement. It was then that I noticed something that had gone unnoticed. The ground under the swing was slightly marked, as if someone had been there recently, something that seemed recent despite the rain that had fallen. I bent down, taking a closer look, and noticed footprints in the mud, footprints that didn't belong to any child playing. They were not normal footprints. They seemed to have been dragged, as if someone had been dragged from there, from the swing set to the nearby road. Unease grew inside me. I decided to investigate further. Something was pushing me to do so, a deep feeling in my stomach that I could not ignore. I moved even closer to the swing, my body tense, the sound of my footsteps almost drowned out by the heaviness of the atmosphere. I looked at the ropes. They were wet, but still sturdy. They didn't look like they had been used recently, but they didn't look at all old either. It was strange. Everything was. As my gaze roamed the park, my thoughts began to drift to something I had heard, a rumor that was whispered in the streets, a crime, a murder that had occurred in this very park years before. I remember it being mentioned to me once, in a trivial conversation about local history, a murder that had occurred on a rainy afternoon in a park that, for some reason, had been marked by grief and tragedy. I couldn't help but make the connection. The swing, the footprints, the sense that something dark had been trapped in that place. I decided to investigate further, even though I knew I shouldn't have. The footprints in the mud, the empty swing still swaying, were calling me. There was something I needed to know, something I couldn't let go. I made my way to a nearby bench and sat down, watching the swing more closely, trying to remember the details of the crime I had heard about years before. I remember that the murder occurred on a rainy afternoon, just like today. A young woman had been found in the park near the swing set, apparently brutally murdered. News reports spoke of an unidentified victim, and for weeks, there was speculation about the identity of the killer. The police had investigated, but the case was never solved. They had closed the file for lack of evidence. The young woman appeared to have been killed in a surprise attack, but what was most disturbing was the scene in which she was found. The swing was moving in the same way it was moving now, as if something or someone was trapped in that spot, at that very moment. The rain started again. As the drops fell on my face, my mind began to wander even more. Something in the air, something in the atmosphere was changing. The feeling of being watched suddenly hit me. I turned quickly, looking for something, but saw no one. The park was still empty. Only the sound of the swing and the rain broke the silence. However, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. I got up from the bench, my footsteps echoing on the wet ground. I decided to walk a little further through the park, away from the swing, but my curiosity wouldn't let me go. I returned to the area where I had seen the footprints in the mud. Something told me that if I followed the marks, I might discover more. Maybe I would find something that would explain why the swing was moving the way it was. Maybe there was more behind the untold story. As I walked, my mind kept returning to the murder. There was something strange about the way the details of the case intertwined with my current experience. The fact that the swing was moving, the fact that the young woman had been found nearby, the footprints, everything seemed to indicate that it wasn't just a coincidence. As I followed the footprints, I came to a secluded corner of the park. A dark, tree-covered place where the shadows lengthened and mingled with the mist that was beginning to form. In that corner, among the underbrush and broken branches, something glimmered on the ground. I crouched down, my heart pounding, and saw what it was. A cell phone, covered in mud and rainwater. I picked it up carefully, my hands shaking. I knew this object could contain something crucial. It could have belonged to the victim, or at the very least, be the key to understanding what had happened that night. I turned on the phone cautiously, though I wasn't expecting much. The screen flickered briefly, and then a series of messages appeared, messages that revealed something disturbing. The young woman, before she was killed, had been in contact with someone. The messages were threatening, disturbing. They spoke of a meeting in the park, of a swing. Suddenly, everything clicked. The murder had not been an impulsive act. It had been premeditated, and the swing had been part of the crime scene, a place where the victim's fate had been sealed. The rain did not stop. The sound of the water falling on the park, the swing that kept moving, the phone in my hands. Suddenly, I understood that this park was not just a playground. It was a place marked by suffering, a place where something dark had happened and where somehow the echoes of that tragedy were still resonating. I walked away from the park with the phone in my hand, feeling that something inside me had changed forever. I had unearthed a secret, one I should never have known, and I wondered if the answers I had found were worth it. It was a cold night, one of those nights when the air becomes crisp and the darkness seems thicker than usual. It wasn't the kind of party I would normally attend, but there was something about the invitation that caught my attention. An exclusive event, a costume party, and a warning on the card. Remember, masks don't just cover the face, they reveal the truth of who we are. A strange message, I admit, but it only increased my curiosity. My friends were among the organizers, and I couldn't turn down the opportunity to join them. There was something intriguing about all this, something I couldn't quite figure out. The house where the party was being held was huge, an ancient mansion that stood like a colossus in the middle of the darkness. The garden was carefully lit, but despite the music emanating from inside, a strange feeling of emptiness enveloped me. It wasn't fear, but a kind of uneasy anticipation, as if something was about to happen, even if I didn't know what. The entrance to the place was decorated with macabre figures, ancient masks, and dim lights that cast strange shadows on the walls. Already at the threshold, I noticed something curious. The guests, though they all seemed to be enjoying the party, wore intricate masks, elegant for the most part, that meticulously concealed their faces. There was a sense of anonymity, an air of secrecy that permeated every corner. When I walked in, the music seemed to resonate more intensely, and the crowd surrounded me. At first, everything seemed to be in order, like any other party. People were talking to each other, laughing, toasting, and dancing. However, something was not right. There was a latent tension, as if everyone was carefully watching everyone else, waiting for someone to make the wrong move. The masks covering their faces seemed to become a second skin, and I couldn't help but feel that they were all playing a part, like actors in a play, performing a much darker role than I had imagined. I headed towards the bar, trying to relax a bit. My gaze roamed the room, looking for my friends, but something stopped me. I saw a man in the center of the room, whose mask was different from the others. It was not a simple costume accessory. It was an ancient mask, metallic, with intricate details and a piercing gaze, as if looking straight through the others. It was haunting, disturbing, and its presence seemed to draw a strange energy around it. It wasn't just the mask that unnerved me, but the fact that no one seemed to approach him. He stood erect, motionless, like a statue, surrounded by the crowd, but isolated from everyone. I stood watching for a few moments, and that's when a hand on my shoulder snapped me out of my trance. I turned quickly and found Marta, a friend of mine from college. Her mask, simple but elegant, covered only half of her face, exposing her eyes. I saw her smile and was relieved to see her, since, up to that point, I didn't know anyone else at the party. I decided to follow her and join the conversation. However, as we walked around the room, something strange started to happen. As we went along, I noticed that some people stopped when they saw us, watching us with an uncomfortable intensity, as if they were looking for something in particular. As if somehow, they knew something we didn't know. When we reached the corner, Marta stopped and looked at me in a strange way, her expression somewhat distant. For a moment, I thought she was watching me in a different way, but instantly, her face relaxed again and she smiled as usual. I tried to ignore him, but I couldn't. Something in the atmosphere told me that there was something hidden, something that no one dared to reveal. As the party progressed, I became more uncomfortable. Conversations became more tense, more superficial. Every time I looked at the people around me, the mask seemed less like a festive accessory and more like a barrier hiding something much deeper. The heavy atmosphere enveloped me. Every laugh, every toast seemed to be laden with hidden meaning. The place was full of mysteries, and what had started out as a fun party was turning into a strange, unsettling scenario. It was then that Marta suggested that I participate in a game. One that, she explained to me, all the attendees should play upon arrival. A game of masks, a game that, apparently, revealed who were true friends and who were not. With a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, I agreed. I didn't know what it would consist of, but the idea of discovering something hidden was tempting. We headed towards a table where several of the guests were already gathered. Each of them wore a different mask, and some of them looked at each other with a mixture of complicity and distrust. The organizer of the party, a man whose face was covered by a somber mask, began to explain the rules. The game was simple. Each person had to guess the identity of the others from the clues offered to them. The more correct they were, the closer they would be to discovering the truth behind the masks. The first turn was mine. I was offered 3 clues about a random guest. Clues that didn't seem to make sense at first, but as I listened to them, something began to click. The clues spoke of things that only a close friend might know. Secrets shared between people, lived experiences that were not known to the general public. I was surprised to realize that these clues were much more personal than I had imagined. When it was my turn, I felt a strange pressure. Suddenly, I began to doubt. The clues I was given about the identities of the people around me did not match what I knew about them. Something didn't fit. I began to wonder if everyone at that party was really who they said they were, or if everyone, like me, was participating in a much bigger game than I imagined. I looked at Marta, searching for an answer in her eyes, but saw only an impassive expression behind her mask. I felt the air grow thicker, as if the answers were too close to reach. I decided to take a risky decision. As the game progressed, I watched each of the participants more closely, trying to see something beyond the masks, looking for signs that would tell me who they really were. It was then that I inadvertently overheard a conversation between 2 people, their voices low and hurried. One of the people mentioned something about keeping up appearances and going along with the plan. That was all I needed to understand that there was something darker behind it all. The truth slowly began to reveal itself. Marta, my friend, was not who she claimed to be, and the others, those who seemed to be strangers, were more involved than I imagined. They had all played a part in a much more complex and dangerous plot, and the party was merely an excuse to keep the masks on, both physical and metaphorical. In the end, as the last round of the game came to an end, I realized that I had been fooled from the beginning. The clues, the masks, the smiles. It had all been part of an elaborate game of deception, and I, unbeknownst to me, had been caught up in it. I remember that afternoon the city was wetter than usual. The sky, covered with heavy gray clouds, threatened more rain. I wasn't planning to stay out of the house for long, but the day had an inexplicable urgency, as if it was calling me to go out, to walk. I walked along the usual familiar streets, with no specific direction, just out of a desire to clear my mind. It was at that moment, when I decided to enter a small cafe on the corner, that the strange discovery occurred. I needed a bathroom, and as always, I chose the one in a familiar place. It was a public restroom downtown, a place I had been in several times, with its walls worn by time and the marks of who knows how many hands had touched the place. Nothing about it was particularly remarkable, but something made me pause when, as I entered the cubicle, I saw something written on the wall. It wasn't a common message, like those scribbles you see in public restrooms, or a phone number or an anonymous statement. No, this was different. The message was coded, a set of numbers and letters, seemingly random, but with a pattern that I found disturbing. I approached the wall, rubbing my eyes as if I thought I was seeing wrong. The code seemed to have been there for a long time, on the worn surface of the wall paint, and it was written in an ink that had not faded despite the years. It was a very simple code, but, at the same time, very enigmatic. 16 to 3, 25, 9 to 1, 14, 18, 20, 18. I stared at it for a while, not knowing what to do. My mind couldn't stop spinning around that sequence of numbers and letters. A strange impulse led me to take out my cell phone and photograph it. I didn't know why I was doing it, but the feeling that this code might mean something more than just a scribble was too strong to ignore. As I came out of the bathroom, I felt that something had changed. The city, which seemed normal and routine to me before, now seemed to be full of possible secrets. The code kept going round and round in my head, like a catchy melody that you couldn't get out of your mind. I decided to search for its meaning, even though I had no idea what was in store for me. The first thing I did was to search the internet, but I didn't find anything. There was simply no reference to such a code. I tried different combinations, but each attempt seemed more futile than the last. However, something was urging me to keep going. I couldn't get the idea out of my head that this code had to be part of something much bigger. Several days passed, and as life went on, the code on the wall lingered in my thoughts. I decided to take a different approach. I went back to the cafe, to the same bathroom. The place was emptier than the first time, almost desolate. There weren't many people there at that hour, so I felt safe going into the same cubicle. I wanted to see if there was anything else, anything that might shed light on what it all meant. And I found it. On the adjoining wall, there was something else, an incomplete sentence that seemed to continue where the code ended. The treasure is near, but only those who can read will see it. The words were written in the same ink as the code, in the same handwriting. My heart began to beat faster. The enigma was taking shape, and I couldn't help it. It was not just a meaningless message on a wall, but a clue, a map to something lost. A treasure? An ancient secret that had been hidden for so long? The phrase kept running through my head. The treasure was near, but only those who can read will see it. What exactly did read mean in this context? I started researching again, but this time I didn't just search online. I went to libraries, talked to local history experts, even asked some of the older inhabitants of the town, looking for some reference to a lost treasure or some ancient code that matched the one I had seen on the wall. But it all seemed like a dead end. Nobody knew anything. Some even looked at me as if I was crazy, as if it made no sense what I was looking for. However, something inside me told me that I had to go on. There was an impulse I could not control, a need to solve the mystery. I began to obsess over the code, trying to decipher its meaning. The phrase on the wall, the code itself, everything was beginning to take more shape. One night, as I was going over the numbers and letters in my mind, a possibility occurred to me. Maybe the letters represented something. A system of correspondence between numbers and letters, like the alphabet. If I took the number 16, for example, and matched it to the letter P, then 3 would be the letter C, and so on. I tried this, and to my surprise, the resulting letters formed words, PCT and art. This seemed like a clue, but it didn't make much sense on its own. However, something about the combination made me think of something else. In art seemed to be a clear indication of a place, something related to art, perhaps a gallery or museum. I decided to investigate further on this topic. Was there an art gallery or an old museum in town that might have something related to the code? Maybe there was something hidden there. I spent the next few days touring the city, visiting the smaller galleries and museums, asking the staff if they knew of anything strange, any missing pieces or works that had mysteriously disappeared. At first I found nothing, but my persistence finally paid off. An elderly woman who ran an antique store told me about an old painting that had been stolen decades ago. She said that it had never been found again, and that in her youth, She had heard stories about a hidden treasure related to that painting. The painting had been called the Grim Revelation. I felt a shudder. Could this be the connection? Was I on the trail of a lost work, a hidden treasure related to the painting? The woman gave me a name, the last known owner of the painting, a private collector who had mysteriously disappeared. No one had seen it since. I decided to find out more about him. His name was Richard Arnott, a businessman who had been well respected in his day, but who, it seemed, had been known for his ties to organized crime and for his private collection of stolen art. According to rumors, he had hidden the painting somewhere in the city before disappearing. My research led me to the ruins of an old building, a place that had been part of an office complex at the time, but had been abandoned years ago. What I discovered there changed everything. On one wall, in a windowless room, were more codes, more letters and numbers. As I deciphered them, the words came together, revealing what I had been looking for. The treasure is in the ruins, in the last room. The last room. I was in a building that somehow still seemed to hold a trace of what it once was. And at that moment, I knew that the code on the public restroom wall had led me exactly there. The lost treasure, the pieces of the puzzle, everything fit. I didn't know what I would find in that room, but what I discovered in the ruins changed my life forever. Not only did I find the treasure, but the story behind it, and with it, the dark secret that had remained buried for so long. I never imagined that a simple find, something so trivial, would change my life the way it did. The rain was falling furiously that afternoon. The sky was covered by a blanket of clouds so dark they barely allowed daylight through. I was in an antique store, looking for a gift for my mother, when I saw it. On a dusty shelf surrounded by forgotten objects was an antique pocket watch. Its design was intricate, with a gold dial slightly worn by the passage of time. But what struck me most was its peculiar appearance. The second hand seemed to move irregularly, sometimes stopping completely, and then, as it continued its course, spinning with dizzying speed. I don't know why, but something inside me urged me to approach and examine it more closely. The store was quiet, dimly lit, with the scent of aged wood and dust filling the air. The objects on the shelves seemed to carry hidden stories, but the clock seemed different. Strange. Out of place. I took it in my hands. At first, I thought of nothing but its curious mechanism. As I wound it up, the watch began to run regularly, but instantly, I noticed something strange. The watch stopped making noise. The ticking I had heard just seconds before disappeared. Suddenly, the air seemed heavier, and the stillness in the tent was almost oppressive. I felt a pressure in my chest, as if the atmosphere itself was pressing down on me. I looked around me. The tent remained intact, but the silence was absolute. Not a speck of dust stirred in the air. Even the rain pattering on the windows had ceased to sound. I approached the window. What I saw left me paralyzed. The water was falling in straight threads, as if time had stopped completely. I couldn't believe it. Was it possible that what I had done with that clock had caused this phenomenon? I closed the clock, and as I did so, the sound of the world returned. The rain pounded on the windows again with its characteristic patter, and the air, which had been thick, suddenly cleared. Yet something inside me knew it couldn't be a fluke. The clock. I could stop time. The man who ran the store, an old man with a wrinkled face and piercing eyes, watched me in silence. He didn't say a word, but his look seemed to say it all. He knew what had happened. I approached him, but I didn't dare ask him about the watch. I knew something wasn't right. Maybe I shouldn't have even touched it. That night, back in my apartment, I couldn't stop thinking about the watch. Had it really stopped time? What implications would this have? After all, an artifact with such power could be no ordinary thing. My curiosity led me to wind it up one more time, to see if what I had experienced that afternoon was not a hallucination. Again, as I wound it up, the same sepulchral silence enveloped me. This time I felt more confident. I checked the time on the clock and then looked around me. Time stood still, exactly as before. The clock made no noise, but by touching the hands, I could move them at will, making the seconds and minutes pass faster, or even stopping them altogether. At first, the power to manipulate time seemed fascinating, a unique gift. But soon, something changed. Somehow, I began to notice that every time I used the watch, something strange was happening in my real life. Little details. At first it was trivial things, like finding that the food in my refrigerator was in the same state as before, even though it had been hours since I had bought it. Or going into the bathroom, noticing that the mirror seemed to distort my reflection slightly, as if something wasn't right. But things quickly took a turn for the worse. One morning I woke up late, something that didn't usually happen to me. The clock had been on my nightstand, but as I looked at it, I noticed something was different. The hands were not moving as usual. They seemed to be stuck in a strange position, as if time had stopped. But this time, the world was still going on. As I got up and went out into the hallway, I heard a noise coming from the living room. Something that hadn't been there before. Something moving. Something strange, as if someone was in my house. Fear gripped me. I approached slowly, each step echoing on the wooden floor. As I reached the living room door, I saw a figure in front of the window. It was my own reflection. No, it wasn't a reflection. It was me. But as I looked into my eyes, something didn't fit. The expression on my face was empty, cold, as if I wasn't alive. My breathing quickened, and I took a step back. It was at that moment that everything began to fall apart. The clock stopped ticking, but the damage was done. As I tried to understand what was happening, I began to see more disturbing details. The clock was not only stopping time, it was affecting everything it touched. Every time I used it, reality became a little more distorted. At first, I tried to ignore it, thinking that I could control the use of the watch, but I soon discovered that this was not the case. The watch had a hold on me, and the more I used it, the more my life began to fall apart. The people around me were changing. My friends seemed to lose their faces, their voices. Every interaction became colder, more distant. The shadows on the street seemed to lengthen and warp, as if something was lurking, waiting to devour me. My life was no longer the same. Every time I wound the watch, the pieces of the puzzle became more and more uncontrollable. Worst of all, I couldn't stop wearing it. I knew that if I did, something even worse could happen. However, I couldn't resist the temptation. The idea of having absolute power over time, of changing things, of going back and correcting my mistakes, was irresistible to me. Finally, one night, the watch stopped working completely. No matter how many times I wound it up, no matter how many attempts I made. Time continued to run its course, but I knew that something irreversible had happened. The clock could no longer stop time, but the consequences of having done so were still there, unrelenting. The people around me kept changing, disappearing. The shadows, once only lengthening, now followed me everywhere. I felt trapped in a distorted reality, a place I could not escape from. The clock had done more than alter time. It had altered my life, my mind, my perception of the world. I kept it in a drawer, far away from me, hoping that the damage I had caused might fade away. But I knew, deep inside me, that nothing would ever be the same again. The clock had already stopped time once, but at a much greater cost. Time in my life would never be the same again. I was never a person who believed in coincidences. In fact, it has always seemed to me that life has a peculiar way of intertwining events, as if everything were directed by invisible threads that guide us without our knowing it. It was on a gray afternoon, with the rain pounding on the windows and the wind blowing leaves through the streets, that I found the tape. There was nothing out of the ordinary in that thrift store. Its shelves were filled with old items, forgotten by time, and the shelves of VHS videos had a dusty, neglected air. The store didn't stand out, and what I found there didn't seem special at first either. It was only a fleeting moment that made me stop in front of a shelf full of tapes. It was a box without a label, with an inscription in red ink, something that seemed a little strange to me, but nothing more. The contents had no visible details, just a number and a symbol that seemed to have been written by hand. An inexplicable impulse led me to take it. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe something else, but I felt I had to take it. When I got home, after checking the contents of the box a couple of times, I settled down in front of my TV and popped the tape into the player. The screen flickered for a few seconds before a clear picture appeared. It was a room. I wasn't surprised at first, as many home recordings start out similarly. The camera was focused on a table, on which there were several objects, though I couldn't make them out clearly at first glance. The image looked normal, even somewhat dull. But then, at the bottom edge of the screen, I saw something that made me freeze. It was my own face. The face of someone who looked like me, only younger. My heart skipped a beat. The image didn't last more than a few seconds, but what I saw transfixed me. The camera zoomed out and focused on other details. The decor of the room, a lighted lamp, the window overlooking a familiar landscape. I couldn't remember what the place was, but something inside me told me I knew it. The recording continued, but now everything seemed stranger and stranger to me. The objects on the table began to take a more definite shape, and little by little, I began to recognize them. Some keys, a folder with crumpled papers, and most disturbingly, a photograph. My photograph. The face in the picture was the same face that appeared in the recording, but that picture was taken at a time when I was about 16 years old. The sense of terror I felt at that instant was indescribable. Everything began to spin around me, as if I was being pulled into a spiral from which I could not escape. How was it possible that someone had this recording? And more to the point, how could it be so clearly connected to my life? The image suddenly changed, and the camera shifted to focus on a slowly closing door. I could hear the faint creak of the hinges, a familiar sound that echoed in my ears, but made me feel a growing discomfort. As the camera moved around the room, it paused for a moment on a painting on the wall. The painting depicted a landscape scene, but the most disturbing thing was that in that painting, in the background, there was something else. It was not a human figure, but it was something that seemed to be watching whoever looked at the painting. The camera moved to the corner of the room, and there, right in that corner, I found a file. A file with my name on the label. Sweat began to run down my back as my hands trembled slightly. I looked at the screen in a state of total shock. How was this possible? I couldn't comprehend it. Minutes passed, and the recording progressed in eerie detail. The camera seemed to capture specific moments of my life, but not in the sense of memories. No, it was as if I was witnessing moments of my existence that had not yet occurred. The recording of the room continued, but now I could see more clearly the walls, the cabinet where the file with my name on it was, and more details that seemed more and more familiar. I knew I had been there before. I recognized it, but I couldn't remember when. The recording continued, and the images began to become more intense. Several scenes of my life were shown, of moments I had forgotten, but which were now being relived before my eyes. My first job, a meeting with a coworker, and then the camera focused on a detail that made me shudder. A conversation in a cafe. Although the sound was unclear, the gestures of the people who appeared were recognizable. Suddenly, my image appeared again. But this time, something was different. My face looked altered, distorted, as if someone was manipulating the recording in real time. At that moment, a different sound began to play on the recording. A muffled, low sound, as if someone was speaking in whispers. I didn't understand what they were saying, but an uncomfortable feeling came over me. I closed my eyes for a moment, But when I opened them, the image on the screen changed once again. It was a landscape, a building I didn't recognize, but the camera focused on it in detail. The facade, the windows, everything looked strange. However, in the lower right corner, right next to the door, I saw a small detail. Something I hadn't noticed before. A name. The recording didn't clearly show the signage, but I could make out one word. A single word that made my blood run cold. My own last name. The movie ended suddenly. The screen went black, and a heavy silence pervaded the room. I stared at the screen for several seconds, unable to move. Fear gripped me, but there was also a growing need to understand. How had this recording been made? Why were so many details of my life appearing, but beyond what I had experienced up to that point? I felt the need to search for more answers, but at the same time, a deep fear stopped me. What was going on? What did it all entail? I decided to go back to the thrift store the next day. But when I arrived, something strange happened to me. The store was no longer there. The building was empty, as if it had never existed. Not a single sign that anything had ever been in that place. The store wasn't on the map, and no one seemed to remember it. The recording, although disconnected from my daily life, continued to haunt me. Something inside me knew that, although I had tried to put it behind me, the connection to my own existence was much deeper than I had imagined. And although everything now seemed darker and more confusing, something told me that it wasn't over yet, that the secrets hidden in that recording were yet to be revealed, but in a way I could never have anticipated. I moved to the neighborhood looking for peace and quiet. After a long period of work stress and a life that seemed to be stuck in a never-ending routine, I decided it was time for a fresh start. I found a small house in a neighborhood that promised to be perfect. Quiet streets, friendly neighborhoods, and an atmosphere that suggested that time was moving at a different pace. It was the kind of place that promised peace. But there was something about my new home that I couldn't ignore. An unsettling feeling that wouldn't go away, even after I had unpacked and adjusted the place to my liking. The house itself was nothing special. It was old, but well preserved, with a brick facade that looked like it had been painted sometime in the 1970s. It was not far from my house, on a corner, with a garden that had been abandoned years ago. However, despite the life that seemed to permeate the neighborhood, the abandoned house always seemed lonely. For the first week, I saw hardly any movement there. The funny thing was that even though the house seemed empty, I always had the feeling that someone was watching it. From the moment I arrived, the house caught my attention. It was as if, amidst the bustle of the neighborhood, she was in another world, disconnected from the life around her. There was something unsettling about her structure, her dusty windows, her wooden doors creaking in the wind. But what really drew me in was her story, the story that the people around her never seemed to want to tell. At first, I tried to keep my distance. I didn't want to be nosy. I didn't want to be the neighbor meddling in other people's business. But the attraction was too strong. Often, when I went for a walk in the neighborhood, my footsteps would involuntarily lead me toward the house. I would look through the rusty gate and wonder what would have happened there. It wasn't just the age of the place that drew me in, but that nagging feeling that something dark had happened inside those walls. One day, during a regular walk, I decided to get closer. The house was closer than it looked, and at that moment, curiosity got the better of me. I thought maybe something could be explained. At first, the gate was locked, but as I got closer, I realized that it was not secured. With some effort, I managed to open it and stepped through into the garden. Everything was overgrown with weeds, and plants that once should have been tended and pruned had now taken over the space. Every step I took on the ground creaked, as if the house was reacting to my presence. I looked through a broken window, and although I couldn't see clearly, I felt a strange pressure in my chest. There was something about that place, a kind of urgency that I didn't understand. I decided not to stay too long. I quickly returned home, but the image of the house did not fade. For the next few weeks, that image continued to haunt me. Then, I met a neighbor who had lived in the neighborhood for many years. I wanted to know more about the house, and although he was reluctant at first, it didn't take him long to relent and tell me what he knew. The house, he told me, had been uninhabited for more than a decade. The former owners, a family consisting of a man, a woman, and their daughter, had disappeared one stormy night. No one knew what had happened, and the authorities were never able to find them. According to my neighbor, the storm had been especially strong that night. The rain was pouring down relentlessly, and the winds seemed to tear the trees up by the roots. That house was surrounded by tall, old trees, and in that storm, something happened. The next day, when the rain stopped and the sun began to shine timidly, the neighbors noticed that the lights in the house were off, the curtains were drawn, and there was no sign of life. No one saw the family leave or anyone else enter. Everything seemed to be in place, but something was not right. The investigations that followed revealed nothing. The police searched the house, but found nothing out of the ordinary, except for a strange letter the woman had left on the kitchen table. No one remembered exactly what it said, but it was a disturbing message that mentioned something about escaping from something that could not be stopped. No one dared to attach any more importance to it. But after that, the house was uninhabited, and no one lived there again. Hearing this, I felt my mind begin to wander. Was it possible that something so macabre had happened there? Why had no one tried to find out what had happened to that family? Perhaps there was something else behind their disappearance, something that had yet to be discovered. I was overcome with an inexplicable need to know the truth. I wanted to understand what had happened because deep down, I felt that my own life was somehow connected to that house. After talking to my neighbor, I decided that I had to investigate further. I could no longer live near that place without knowing what had really happened. For several nights, I approached the house hoping that something might give me a clue. It was hard to see much, as the windows were covered by brush, and the darkness of the night only made the place seem even more intimidating. One of those nights, while watching from a distance, I noticed that there was a dim light on inside the house. I wasn't sure if I was imagining it or if it was real, but I decided to get close enough to see if anything had changed. As I approached the window, my eyes adjusted to the darkness, and for a moment, I saw something that made my stomach contract immediately. On the kitchen table, an object glowed faintly. I got closer and closer, and it was then that I saw it clearly. It was a letter, just like the one my neighbor had mentioned. The same letter, the same writing, with that same sense of urgency that I still didn't understand. Without thinking twice, I decided to enter. The door was not locked, and as if it was all part of a destiny I could not avoid, I pushed it gently. I entered the house. The air was thick and stuffy, as if the whole place had been sealed for years. Dust covered every corner, but even so, the letter was on the table, just as in the story my neighbor had told me. I picked it up. It was yellowed and worn, but what surprised me even more was what had been written on it. "Time stops here. If you don't run, you will be dragged away." I felt a shudder run through my body as I read those words. The feeling that everything was out of control came over me completely. Whatever had happened here, it wasn't over. At that moment, the door slammed shut, and the sound of the wind at the broken window seemed to disappear, leaving only the echo of my breathing. Something was changing, and I couldn't escape the feeling that I was getting too close to the edge of something much darker than I had imagined. That night, something inside the house was watching me, and its presence did not let me rest until I understood that maybe the family never left. Maybe they had never stopped being there, waiting to be discovered. It was a winter afternoon, one of those when the cold wind caresses the skin and the fallen leaves crunch underfoot. I was in my apartment, in one of those weeks when routine seems to crush you with its weight. I had come home late from work, tired, my mind full of scattered thoughts. I decided to take a quick shower to clear my head, as the days seemed to go by faster and faster. As I dried off, I caught a glimpse of myself in the bathroom mirror. There was nothing strange about that mirror. It was a simple bathroom mirror, rectangular, with a metal frame that was already showing signs of wear. But that afternoon, when I looked into it, something caught my eye. A message appeared, as if it were written with steam or some kind of invisible imprint. I didn't see it right away. The vision was blurry, a reflection only glimpsed for an instant. But on closer inspection, I could read what it said. Beware of what is to come. The message disappeared as quickly as it appeared, and at first I thought it was a product of my tiredness or an optical illusion. I laughed at myself and decided not to make a big deal out of it. However, that night I couldn't stop thinking about it. As I lay in bed, the idea of that message haunted my thoughts. Had it been a trick of my mind, or something else? I didn't know, but an unsettling feeling came over me. The next day, as I was getting ready to leave for work, something strange happened. As I looked in the mirror while shaving, the message appeared again, but this time with a different text. Don't trust him. My heart skipped a beat, and a shiver ran through my body. I looked at the mirror more closely, but this time, instead of disappearing, the words lingered for a few seconds before fading away, as if they were etching themselves into my mind. The feeling of discomfort increased. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was seeing things due to stress or accumulated fatigue, or maybe some imperfection in the mirror was causing those reflections. But the second appearance of the messages made me think something else was going on. There was no way it was a coincidence. Over the next few days, the messages continued to appear, each time with a different warning. Don't go out today. Something's not right. Look behind you. As I saw them, I became more anxious, more puzzled. I couldn't help but wonder where these messages were coming from. Who was leaving them? Was it possible that someone was manipulating the mirror somehow? The options were endless, but none gave me peace. I decided to investigate. I started to look at the mirror more closely, looking for any kind of alteration. I cleaned it, checked the frame, and even removed the mirror from the wall to inspect the back, but found nothing. There were no wires or electronics. It looked like just an ordinary mirror, and yet the messages kept appearing. At first, I felt ridiculous, like I was chasing a fantasy. But when the messages continued and started to get more and more specific, I could no longer ignore them. The truth is right in front of you. Do what I told you. These messages were not random. They seemed to have a purpose. It was as if someone was watching me, following me. The mirror had ceased to be a mere reflective surface and had become something more. A channel, a doorway into a reality I didn't understand. One afternoon, determined to find out what was going on, I began to investigate the provenance of the mirror. I went to the store where I bought it, a small antique store, and asked the owner if he knew anything about the origin of the object. The man, an older guy with a tired look on his face, looked at me with some curiosity before answering. He said that the mirror had belonged to a family that lived in a nearby neighborhood. He explained that the house had been sold a few years ago, and that the mirror had been left in the store because no one had claimed it. He didn't seem to know anything more about it. However, he gave me a clue that made my blood run cold. He mentioned to me that according to rumors, something strange had happened in that house. No one talked about it openly, but some neighbors said that the former owners had mysteriously disappeared, and that people who moved in after them had also had strange experiences, although they never dared to comment on it. He told me of vague rumors about people claiming to see strange things reflected in mirrors, or that objects in the house moved on their own. I couldn't be sure if it was just an urban legend or something more, but I found what he was telling me both disconcerting and frightening. I decided I had to know more. I went back to the house the store owner mentioned, hoping to find some additional clues. The neighborhood was quiet, but the house seemed uninhabited. The proximity of the house made me feel that something was watching me from the windows. At first, I just walked down the street without getting too close. I didn't want to give the impression of being an outsider prying into other people's lives, but the growing sense that something was out of place urged me on. That night, after my visit, when I returned to my apartment and looked in the mirror, the message changed again. You are being watched. This time, the words lingered longer in the mirror, as if they were etching themselves into the surface itself. A cold sweat ran down my back, and for the first time, I felt real fear. Something was very wrong, and the fact that this was all connected to the mirror made me think that not only my life was in danger, but also the lives of the people around me. I decided to do what the message suggested, to look more closely at the people around me. What I discovered took my breath away. One of my coworkers, someone I had spent a lot of time with over the past few months, began to behave strangely. I couldn't identify what had changed in him, but there was something unsettling in his gaze, a kind of dark knowingness that made me suspect he knew more than he seemed to. Every time I looked at myself, that feeling of being watched grew. Every conversation, every gesture, seemed to me to be full of hidden meanings. I couldn't help but wonder if this man, like others throughout my life, was somehow involved in all of this. Was he the one behind the messages in the mirror? Was he the one manipulating me? As the days went by, the messages became more specific. It was not possible to ignore what was happening. The clock of my life seemed to have started counting down, and the pressure was mounting. The warnings I was receiving in the mirror were prompting me to make decisions that I could not understand, but which seemed to be necessary for survival. One day, as I was preparing for an important meeting, the final message appeared. It's him. My hands shook as I read it. I didn't know how, but I was now certain that someone close to me was involved. Fear paralyzed me, and I felt the answer was about to be revealed, inevitably. Suddenly, everything that had been happening made sense. The messages in the mirror not only warned me of what was to come, but also guided me to the truth. I didn't know what I would do once the truth was clear, but I couldn't turn back. The game had begun, and I could only hope that the final message in the mirror was not a death sentence. It was a seemingly ordinary afternoon when it all began. I was sitting in my apartment, working on a project I had been putting off. The fatigue of long hours in front of the screen was clouding my mind, and my concentration was already waning. However, it was at that moment, when the noise of the city outside seemed to dampen and the atmosphere became heavier, that it happened. I began to hear voices, or rather thoughts. They were not whispers or murmurs, but something clearer, more precise. At first, I thought it was my imagination playing tricks. After all, weeks of accumulated stress can cause one to start hearing things that don't exist. But as the minutes passed, I realized it wasn't just a hallucination. I could hear my neighbors' voices through the walls. The thoughts of the people on the street, of those passing by my window, became clear in my mind. I felt invaded, as if the whole world was inside my head. The first thing I tried to do was to block it. I tried to concentrate on my work, but I could not. The voices blended together, and each word was as clear as if they were speaking directly into my ear. A stranger's thoughts, a mother's concern for her child, a couple's doubts in a coffee shop, all became part of my reality. It was unbearable at first, a constant murmur that kept rumbling in my head. I realized that I could pick up people's thoughts without wanting to, as if there was an invisible connection between their minds and mine. At first, I tried to ignore it. I thought it was just a temporary disorder, something that would pass. But it didn't. The days went on, and the connection became more intense, more invasive. I was no longer just listening to what others were thinking, but could distinguish between conscious and unconscious thoughts. I began to know people's intentions before they manifested them. I felt like I was about to go crazy. There were times when I could not distinguish whether my own thoughts were my own or whether they were the thoughts of others. I was losing track of my identity. Over time, I learned to manage it. At first, I concentrated on blocking everything out, but then I discovered that I could partially control the intensity of the voices. Somehow, I could filter out the clearer thoughts, although there was always something that affected me. I could no longer live without that constant pressure. without that invisible presence that was always on my mind. It was as if the walls of my head were constantly on the verge of collapsing. But then something changed. I began to notice patterns, not in other people's thoughts, but in my own. There were times when, without knowing how, I felt that my own thoughts were not entirely my own. At first, I thought it was just stress, a manifestation of my anxiety. However, I soon realized that something else was going on. The thoughts were not only coming from others, but also from a source I could not identify, someone who was manipulating me from the shadows. At times, it was so clear I could almost hear it, a voice inside my mind that seemed to be shaping my thoughts. I didn't know how it did it, but it could influence what I felt, what I thought. The first time I became aware of this was when I began to hear thoughts that didn't make sense. Go over there. See what's waiting for you. I didn't understand what he meant, but the feeling was unmistakable. I felt watched, as if someone was watching my every move. I tried to ignore it, but the more I tried, the stronger it became. At first I told myself that it was all part of a mental process, a consequence of my own fears. But I soon realized that this voice, this presence, had more than just influence on me. It could make me do things, as if its will was infiltrating mine, forcing me to follow instructions. The voice was never clear, but its influence was. It became harder and harder to resist. One night, after a long day of work, I decided to go for a walk to clear my mind. I was in that confused state, trying to understand what was going on in my life, when I felt a stronger pressure in my head, as if someone was pushing my thoughts in a specific direction. Something inside me was telling me that I had to go somewhere, a place I didn't recognize. The funny thing is that I didn't even question it. It was as if the decision had already been made for me, unbeknownst to me. I went, walking as if guided by an invisible hand. I ended up in a park near my house, a park that had never attracted me before. The air was cold, and the atmosphere seemed thick, as if something was about to happen. I sat down on one of the benches, and without knowing why, began to look at the sky. Suddenly the voice came back to my mind. This time the words were clearer than ever. Don't worry, everything is under control. Just follow the next step. A shiver ran through my body. Something was not right. Something inside me was telling me that this was not my will. I didn't know if I was crazy or if I was really being manipulated, but at that moment the truth began to sink in. There was someone, or something, that was in control. Someone who was pulling my strings, leading me down a path I didn't understand. The thought that my decisions were not entirely my own filled me with dread. That night, sleep did not come. I sat in the dark, trying to reason about what was happening, but it was useless. The connection, that presence that was manipulating my thoughts, was still there, always in the back of my mind. I couldn't escape it. I didn't know who it was or what it wanted, but I felt it. It was watching, waiting, controlling. The next day, I decided to confront what was going on. I needed to know who or what was behind it all. The thought of being manipulated filled me with despair. But I didn't know where to start. How does one deal with a mind that seems to have more power than one's own? The first clue I got was when I decided to investigate the connection. I spent hours going through old experiments on the human mind, on telepathy, but I found nothing that explained what was happening. It was in an online forum, an obscure corner of the internet, where I found a reference that mentioned a strange phenomenon. People who had experienced something similar to what I was experiencing. At first, the comments seemed irrelevant, but then one of them caught my attention. It said that there were people who had been manipulated through their own thoughts, controlled by an external force that infiltrated their minds without them realizing it. Some claimed that even the thoughts they believed to be their own were planted by others. But, most frightening of all, the source was never identified. It was a mystery, a dark presence that was beyond human comprehension. My heart was pounding as I read those words. Then I understood what was happening. There was someone, or something, that was manipulating my thoughts. I was being controlled, and I didn't know how to stop it. It was a terrifying feeling, as if my mind no longer belonged to me. Fear gripped me. I decided I had to end this somehow. But at the same time, something told me that what I was facing was much bigger than me. Something darker, more dangerous, that could end my life if I didn't act carefully. From that moment on, I no longer knew what was real and what was not. I lived with the constant feeling that someone was watching me, manipulating my thoughts. Every action, every decision, seemed to be influenced by that unseen presence. And though I struggled to regain control of my life, something told me it was too late. My mind was no longer mine. I never imagined that my visit to that library would be the beginning of something so disturbing. I had come with the simple intention of researching a famous author, one I had always admired for his unique style and his ability to evoke complex emotions with every word. His name was written on the shelves of almost every bookstore, and his books were part of my personal collection. I had no particular reason to go there, just curiosity. At first, I was just thinking of a quiet afternoon among shelves of forgotten books, looking for something that would offer me new perspectives on a writer I already knew so well. The library was a large, old and silent place, with the scent of aged paper permeating the air. The aisles stretched endlessly, and the shelves full of books seemed to buckle under their own weight. I sat down at a table, surrounded by dusty shelves, and began to search for information about the author. There was something peculiar about this library, something that seemed out of place. The feeling of being watched lingered in the air, but I didn't pay much attention to it at the time. I was still immersed in my search, scanning the shelves full of worn volumes. That's when I found the diary. It was tucked away in a corner, almost as if out of place among the other books. It was not a large or imposing book. It was a dark brown, hardcover notebook with a small gold stamp on the cover. The stamp bore the name of the author I had admired so much, but there was something about the notebook that puzzled me. The stamp looked somewhat ancient, as if it had been placed there many years after the book was written. I could not resist the temptation to open it. As I did so, I felt a strange electricity in the air, as if the notebook itself were alive. The first few pages were filled with tight, flowing handwriting, difficult to read at first. But as I turned the pages, the words began to become more legible, and the contents absorbed me completely. It was the author's personal diary, or so it seemed, but it was no ordinary diary, not like the ones you'd expect to find in the library. What got me was the tone of the words. Something in them told me that this author had had a much darker and more complicated life than his public image suggested. It was as if, as I read, the pages were filled with a growing sense of unease, something that was trying to warn me. In the first pages, the author talked about his personal life in a rather superficial way. There were passages about his childhood, about his parents, his love for writing, but as I progressed through the diary, I noticed that the tone changed. The words were more urgent, more desperate. There were mentions of people I had never heard named in her official biographies, characters who seemed to be involved in her life in a way I would never have imagined. There were also mentions of places that appeared nowhere else, obscure and isolated places the author had visited in his youth. Most disconcerting of all was a series of entries that began to appear more frequently. There was something about them, something that turned my stomach. The author was talking about secrets, things he had done that no one should know about. He said that his literary success had not only been the result of his talent, but of decisions that had irreversibly compromised him. He began to write about his involvement in a series of strange events that had linked him to powerful people, people who seemed to be in the shadows, controlling every aspect of his life. It was hard to understand what I was reading. Some of the entries were so cryptic that I couldn't help but feel that the author was leaving me clues, as if he wanted someone else to know the truth. There were mentions of encounters with influential figures of the time, figures who seemed to have considerable influence in the literary world, but who never appeared in historical records. The events he described seemed to be shrouded in utter mystery. He referred to secret meetings, deals in the dark, and a web of power that, he believed, was manipulating the course of literature and culture in general. As I read on, I felt more trapped, as if I was unraveling a mystery much bigger than I had imagined. The author had been involved in something dark, something that had been completely hidden from the public eye. Each time I turned a page, the diary revealed more disturbing details. There were mentions of people who had disappeared, events that had never been explained, and moral decisions that made me wonder if the author had really been the man we all thought he was. It wasn't long before the restlessness completely overcame me. I could no longer stop reading. I needed to know more. Something in the diary was absorbing me, as if I was trapped in a web of lies and manipulations. The last pages, more deteriorated by the passage of time, contained the key to the mystery. The author in the last entries described how he had begun to feel persecuted, not by the authorities, not by literary critics, but by something much more sinister. He spoke of feeling watched, of receiving anonymous letters and strange phone calls. He said that he had begun to doubt everything around him, that the people in his life, even his closest friends, began to seem strange, as if they were acting under an outside influence. But most disturbing was when he mentioned that he had begun to suspect that the very literature that had made him famous had not been written by him alone. He was making references to other people who, he claimed, had been responsible for significant parts of his most successful works. When I finished reading the diary, something in me changed. The author, the man whose life I had admired and whose works I had read over and over again, was no longer the same to me. He was no longer just a brilliant writer who had tugged at the heartstrings of my soul with his words. He was now a man trapped by his own success, by the dark choices he had made that he had never wanted the world to know about. The pieces of the puzzle fit together, but the picture that formed was horrifying. The legacy of the author he had admired so much was based on lies, on dark secrets that no one should know. He had been manipulated, controlled, and his success was not the result of his genius, but of a network of influences that had guided him every step of his career. As I sat there in the empty library with the journal in my hands, I realized that I couldn't just leave it there. I had to decide what to do with that information. The author had made it clear in its final pages that its secrets were to be buried. He had warned that anyone who tried to uncover the truth would be dragged into the same darkness he had experienced. But something inside me told me that the world needed to know. I could not live with the knowledge that a great lie had been woven around his legacy. When I left the library that night, the feeling of being watched never left me. I was carrying with me something far greater than I had thought. Not only had I discovered the secrets of a man who had left his mark on the literary world, but I now carried in my hands the power to destroy everything he had built. Something told me that if I revealed the truth, it would not only be his legacy that would crumble, so would mine. Night had fallen without warning, as a blanket of dense, crushing darkness spread across the city. The wind was battering the windows of my apartment, and the rain, which began as a gentle drizzle, quickly turned into a torrent of cold drops hammering against the glass. Outside, all seemed calm, but inside, the loneliness enveloped me in a different way that night. I couldn't help but feel that something was about to happen, something that would change my life forever. I had lost count of the number of times I had checked my phone, waiting for a call or a message. There had been no news of my brother since his disappearance. It's funny how time can erase details, how one gets used to the emptiness that remains when someone is gone, but still, not a day goes by without his name popping up in my thoughts. 4 years had passed since that night when my brother, Diego, disappeared without a trace. The police found nothing, his friends found nothing, and the questions I asked, the clues I followed, all dissolved like water in the rain. After a while, life went on, but the feeling that something wasn't right, something we didn't know, remained in the air. That night, as I settled on the couch with a cup of tea I couldn't enjoy, the sound of the phone broke the silence. It was an ordinary ringtone, but something inside me quickened. Maybe it was the habit of looking at the screen and finding nothing but unknown numbers. like a cruel joke of fate, or the blurred image of a call that never came. This time, however, it was different. When I saw the number on the screen, I felt my heart racing in my chest. I didn't recognize him, but the way the phone vibrated made me think of Diego, of all those times I tried to contact him, even though he never answered. I was so absorbed in my thoughts, it took me a second longer than it should have taken to answer. At first, all was silence. The light breathing of someone on the other side, as if they were listening to my breathing. I said nothing. I was waiting to hear his voice, even though I knew that couldn't be possible. Time passed, and I couldn't move, as if something had paralyzed me. Then, a broken, weak, but unmistakable voice came from the other side. The voice was Diego's, or so I thought at first. His tone was low, as if he was speaking from far away, as if the distance between us was more than just miles. I didn't know what to say. My words stuck in my throat. He barely whispered a few words. "Everything is connected. Don't trust what you see. Come to the old house." The call was abruptly cut off. There was no warning, only the sound of the unwavering silence that followed the end of those words. I didn't move. I didn't know what to do or how to react. It had been him, hadn't it? It wasn't a hallucination, it wasn't a mistake, was it? My mind began to bombard me with questions. How was it possible that Diego, my brother, could call me after so many years? And what did he mean by "everything is connected"? My heart was pounding, but my body was paralyzed with uncertainty. I got up from the couch and walked to the window, watching the rain pounding hard on the glass. Outside, the streetlights flickered, and the sound of falling water seemed to fill the empty space of my home. I decided I couldn't stay there. I couldn't let that moment dissolve into thin air like so many others. Something inside me told me that I had to do something, that I had to investigate, that I had to find out what was going on. The old house. The mention of the old house immediately made me think of a place. It wasn't just any house, but the one Diego and I grew up in, the one our parents had sold when we were young. After we moved out, the house had been vacant, and no one else had lived there. For years, it was a forgotten place, but like many memories, it never completely faded. Something inside me knew I had to go there. That sense of urgency, that little voice in my head telling me I had to understand what was happening. I didn't take another moment to think about it. With phone in hand, I headed for the door, not realizing what I was about to undertake. The night was dark, and the rain was relentless. I could barely see a couple of meters beyond the windshield of the car, but I didn't care. Driving gave me a sense of control, as if I could control what was happening, even though I knew I could not. When I arrived at the old house, the rain seemed even heavier. The place looked the same, maybe a little more run down, but still familiar. The worn paint on the walls and the dirty windows gave me the feeling that time had left its mark in a cruel way. The door, though locked, didn't seem to have changed at all since I last saw it. I could hear the sound of water falling on the roof and tree branches swaying in the wind. Something in that atmosphere seemed to be warning me, but I couldn't turn back. I went inside, and the creaking of the wooden boards under my feet made me feel a deep discomfort. All was silent, except for the rain and the sounds of the house that seemed to breathe. I climbed the stairs slowly, as if something might jump out of the shadows at any moment. There were no lights. Everything was in darkness. I felt that every corner of the place was permeated with memories I didn't want to remember. Finally, I arrived at Diego's room, the one we had shared as children. The door was ajar, and as I entered, I noticed that something was not right. The room, though cluttered as always, had a strange feeling, as if someone had been there recently. The air was thicker, as if the atmosphere was charged with something. In the center of the room, on the table, was an old wooden box. It was no ordinary box. It was something I recognized immediately. It was the box in which Diego used to keep his most valuable things when we were kids. I opened it carefully, and inside I found something I wasn't expecting. A series of letters and documents. The handwriting on the papers was unmistakable. Diego's. What I saw there made my blood run cold. The letters spoke of strange encounters, of people watching him, of veiled threats, of something much bigger than himself. Something that had been lurking in the shadows, waiting. It said he had made a mistake, that he had gotten himself into something he couldn't undo, something that would cost him everything. As I read on, the feeling that something sinister was hovering over me grew. The call had not been a simple attempt at contact. It hadn't been just a conversation that took me somewhere. Everything Diego had written in those letters had a purpose. I was being manipulated, like a piece in a game I didn't understand. And in the end, it was clear. What had happened that night of his disappearance was no accident. It had been part of something much bigger, something that was still lurking. The last letter said, "I have left you clues." The call was not a mistake. Everything is about to fall apart. Don't trust anyone. They are coming for you too. My heart was pounding, and as I looked out the bedroom window, I saw something that chilled my blood. A car parked in front of the house, in the middle of the rain. It was not alone. The call, the letters, the old house, it all fit, but at a cost I still didn't understand. The mystery of Diego's disappearance was just beginning to unfold, and my life, at that moment, was already hopelessly intertwined with his story. The sky was overcast that morning, a heavy gray that weighed over everything like a tight blanket. It wasn't the kind of day that inspired confidence, but I had to make the trip. There was a destination I had to get to, and even though the fog in my mind seemed to predict some kind of trouble, I couldn't cancel. It was one of those decisions that, in time, you wonder why you didn't avoid them. I decided to use the GPS. Despite having traveled that road several times, I wouldn't risk getting lost in an unfamiliar place, no matter how familiar the route was. My phone connected to the car's navigation system, and before long, the smooth mechanical voice of the app began to guide me. It seemed like an ordinary morning, but the first signs that something wasn't right began when the GPS screen blinked a couple of times before changing direction. I looked at the phone suspiciously. Instead of continuing on the usual route to my destination, the GPS was suggesting a detour. At first, I thought it was a simple error, perhaps a map update that it didn't recognize properly. But seeing that I had no choice but to follow the instructions, I decided to do so. I drove along a road less traveled, lined with trees that almost blocked the sky, and as I went on, the feeling of being guided to an unknown place grew. The road began to narrow and become more winding. Trees covered the entire horizon, creating a green corridor that never seemed to end. There were no signs. There was nothing to indicate the presence of a town or any nearby city. Only the voice of the GPS, which kept telling me to move forward. At that point, the first drops of rain began to fall, and the sound of the water hitting the roof of the car barely disguised the buzzing of the GPS. I stopped for a moment at a bend. I looked out the window and saw an unfamiliar landscape. The fog had begun to form, and the road was lost in a sea of darkness. A shiver ran down my spine, but I couldn't afford to waste time. I decided to keep going. The GPS, as if it were doing its job correctly, was telling me that there was not much time left to reach my destination. What happened next was as strange as it was disconcerting. Suddenly, the GPS began to fail, flashing erratically. The screen was flickering and displaying directions that didn't match what I was seeing out the window. Instead of streets or roads, numbers and symbols appeared that I had no way of understanding. I tried restarting the phone, but had no luck. The route kept telling me to go down a road that seemed to be going nowhere. My anxiety grew, but I decided to trust the technology. I kept moving forward, even though the road was getting narrower and narrower. The landscape became stranger, as if time itself had stopped at some point in the past. There was something unsettling in the stillness of the place, in the total absence of life around me. The rain was still falling, harder now, and the constant sound of the water wrapped around me like a blanket. After what seemed like an eternity, the GPS indicated that I would reach my destination, and at the end of the road, I saw it. A small town. It seemed to be completely secluded from the world. The houses, although well kept, were of a style I had not seen in a long time, as if time had stopped passing for this place. Cobblestone streets, yellow lights twinkling on the lampposts, and the fog creeping across the facades of the houses, as if alive. I stopped at the edge of the entrance to the village, with the car at a standstill. An uneasy feeling began to take hold of me. Something didn't fit. The road I had arrived on didn't seem to connect to anywhere else, and there were no signs indicating the name of the town. The GPS voice had disappeared, and the screen now showed only a straight line, with no specific destination. I decided to get out of the car. Maybe someone in town could help me understand what had happened to my route. But as I walked through the deserted streets, the feeling that something was wrong increased. There wasn't a soul on the street, but the houses seemed to be inhabited. The curtains on the windows moved slightly, as if someone was quietly watching. The cold wind cut through the air, but the feeling of being watched made me feel as if the fog itself was stalking my footsteps. I passed a store that appeared to be closed, but the lights inside were still on. The door was wide open, which gave me the feeling that I was being invited in. I stopped to the side, looking into the store, not daring to enter. The shelves were full of products I didn't recognize, antique items and objects that seemed out of place. Something inside me told me I shouldn't stay there much longer. After a few minutes of aimless walking, I decided to return to the car and leave town. There was no logical explanation for what was happening, but the feeling that something was not right was pushing me to leave. However, when I returned to where I had left the car, I found something that made me stop immediately. The vehicle was no longer there. I looked around, confused. There was no sign of any other cars nearby. The street was empty. I looked again toward the place where I had parked, but now everything seemed blurry, as if the place was being swallowed by fog. What once looked like a clear path was now a maze of dead-end streets. My head was spinning. I couldn't understand what was happening, how I had gotten there, how my GPS had taken me to a town that didn't exist on any map. I tried to look for a signal, some connection, but my phone, which had been working again after several attempts, gave me no answer. There was no coverage. Suddenly, I began to hear footsteps in the distance. It wasn't possible. The town was empty, was it? But the footsteps were getting closer, and a figure began to emerge from the fog. It was an older man, with an expressionless expression on his face. His eyes were dark, as if he had not seen daylight for years. As he approached, anxiety swept through me. Without a word, the man walked past me, without looking at me, as if I wasn't there. The sound of his footsteps disappeared quickly, and I stood there, in the middle of the street, with the fog enveloping everything around me. The feeling of being trapped, of having crossed an invisible line between the real and the impossible, hit me with unusual force. I didn't know if I should stay or leave, if there was any point in looking for answers in that place. All I knew was that the GPS had stopped working, my phone had no signal, and I didn't know if I could ever get out of that town. The atmosphere was so thick that it felt like the air itself was trying to choke me. Finally, I decided to walk back towards what I thought was the way out of town. But every step I took seemed to be one more step towards despair. The fog thickened, the houses seemed to move in my eyes, and the feeling of being watched did not leave me. I was no longer sure if I was still in the same reality. The town made no sense, and I, caught in its trap, wondered if I would ever find my way out. I woke up with a strange feeling in my body, as if something had changed during the night. The light coming through the curtains was soft, but I felt overwhelmed by an inexplicable discomfort. As I moved to sit up, I felt a stabbing pain in my left arm, as if something had embedded itself in my skin. I rubbed my eyes, trying to clear my mind, but the discomfort would not go away. When I looked at my arm, I saw what was causing the pain, a tattoo. Not only that, but it was a tattoo I didn't remember getting. An intricate design in black ink, with thin lines that seemed to form a most peculiar symbol. I didn't understand how it could be there, or what it meant. It wasn't my style. It wasn't something I had chosen, let alone remembered going through a tattoo session. The tattoo covered my entire wrist and ran up my forearm to the top of my elbow. The lines intertwined in a symmetrical but also chaotic pattern. I felt a pang of panic at the sight of the design, a sense of deep discomfort. I wasn't sure what to do or where to start, but I knew something wasn't right. It wasn't just the fact that I didn't remember getting the tattoo. It was as if the design itself was trying to tell me something I couldn't decipher. I quickly got out of bed and went straight to the bathroom. I looked at my face in the mirror. Nothing seemed out of place, but anxiety was taking over. Had it been a joke? A mistake? Or was something much more serious going on? I knew I needed answers, and as soon as possible. No one in my close circle seemed to be aware of what had happened, or so I wanted to think. The feeling of bewilderment was unbearable, as if I had fallen into some kind of void from which I could not escape. I decided to get dressed quickly and go out to investigate. I had no idea what to do or where to start, but my first intention was to head for the tattoo store where I usually went. Perhaps, I thought, it could be that I had once decided to, maybe one drunken night, maybe some kind of spontaneous impulse that I couldn't remember. However, as I made my way to the store, something inside me told me that wasn't the reason. The store was closed, something that surprised me, but not enough to stop me. I walked through the streets, my mind whirling around the tattoo, trying to remember any clue, any hint that might give me some explanation. It was then that I saw a sign for an old cafe that had been forgotten in the city. Something inside me pushed me to go in. I didn't know why, but I felt I had to. Inside, the atmosphere was dark, with the dim light of a lamp illuminating the few customers. It was not a place I usually frequented, but something made me think I could find answers there. The waiter looked at me with a vacant smile when I ordered a coffee, and I sat down at a table in the back, trying to collect my thoughts. My mind kept going back to the tattoo. The pattern that formed it looked familiar, but I couldn't place it in any context. There was something about those interlocking lines that felt disturbingly familiar, as if I had seen it before, but not in a dream, not in a fantasy. Suddenly, I felt someone's gaze, a chilling sensation run down my spine. As I looked up, an aged-looking man was staring at me from a nearby table. It was not a man I knew, but his gaze made me feel as if he had been watching me for a long time. I decided to leave. I didn't like the way I felt in that place. The questions that were invading me only made me more paranoid. But before I left, the waiter approached me. His expression changed slightly, and he whispered something to me, though I didn't understand what he said. I paid quickly and hurried out of the cafe, but I felt as if something was following me. I returned home, my mind more confused than ever. The tattoo was still there, but now it looked like more than just a design. What did it really mean? Why did I have it? My search for answers led me to the internet. I searched for symbols, patterns, any clue that might give me an idea. After a couple of hours of unsuccessful browsing, I realized I was looking in the wrong places. Something deeper, more hidden, seemed to be behind it all. Perhaps something to do with people who didn't want to be found, or a secret society that was playing at hiding its existence. I decided I had to investigate further. I went to the public library, where I could search without being interrupted. I knew that if there was any clue about the tattoo, it would be in some forgotten book or hidden reference. I delved through the shelves, looking for books on ancient symbols, secret societies, and anything that might be linked to what I had found on my skin. As I turned the pages of an old book on the occult, my eyes stopped on a section that talked about secret groups, especially those who identified themselves by tattooed symbols. Without knowing why, my pulse increased as I read the words. They described a clandestine organization operating in the shadows of society that used tattoos to mark its members. Most disturbing was when I read that the tattoos were often done in times of great stress or trauma, as a form of control or manipulation. What did that mean to me? Had I been a victim of something like this? The reading continued to reveal details of secret rites, with symbols like mine, which were used to seal pacts. But what left me cold was the mention of a group of people who were given such tattoos as a way of forcing their loyalty. Worst of all, these individuals were not always aware that they had joined this group. They were manipulated in such subtle ways that they never really understood what had happened to them. I returned home, my mind flooded with new questions, but with a terrifying certainty. The tattoo was no accident. There was something else behind it all, something dark that was willing to follow me until I discovered the truth. Whatever happened, I knew I had to go beyond the first clues I had found. I needed to find out who had marked me and why, but I also knew that in doing so, I was walking into something much bigger and more dangerous than I could have imagined. The tattoo, that mark on my skin, was the first step on a journey that would take me to dark places, secrets buried in the past, and I didn't know if I could ever escape it. Ever since I decided to take that cruise, something inside me told me that it was not a good idea. I had done it in the hope of escaping the routine, the monotonous life that had been suffocating me for years. But like most impulsive decisions, I soon began to question whether it was really what I needed. The idea of sailing the open waters appealed to me, but I kept feeling a shadow, a nagging uncertainty that stayed with me even in the quietest moments. The weather was gloomy as the ship set sail, as if the ocean itself agreed with my forebodings. The sky was covered with gray clouds, and the sea breeze was colder than I expected. In spite of everything, I tried to enjoy the trip. The ship was large, luxurious, with facilities that promised all kinds of comforts. The gentle motion of the waves was not enough to calm my anxiety, but I told myself to relax and live in the moment. The days went by, and although the crew did their best to provide a festive atmosphere, I could not escape the feeling that something was not right. Sometimes, as I walked through the ship's corridors, I would notice other passengers looking at me strangely, as if they were keeping some kind of secret. I didn't dare ask, and soon found myself in a cycle of silent observation, noticing little anomalies here and there. One particularly cold night, the captain announced that we had arrived at our destination port, a small harbor in a coastal town that looked like something out of a dark, brooding painting. The ship stopped with a soft creaking sound, and the crew began to prepare to disembark. As everyone was getting ready to get off the ship, something made me look around, as if something was out of place. That's when I saw him. A man who had been with me in the restaurant the night before, having a drink alone at one of the far tables. He seemed to be talking to someone, but I couldn't see the other person. The man looked nervous, his face somber, and there was a palpable tension in his gaze that I couldn't ignore. I was sure I had seen him, but the moment I looked again, he was gone. When we arrived at the port, a tense atmosphere hung in the air. The harbor lights were flickering, creating a more somber atmosphere. People were hurrying to leave the ship, eager to explore the city, but I couldn't stop thinking about the man who had disappeared. Something about his behavior had disturbed me, and my curiosity began to take over. That night, as I tried to rest in my cabin, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The ship, which had been my home for days, no longer seemed so welcoming. I felt strange, uneasy, as if something was not right. When I woke up the next day, the weather had worsened considerably. A thick fog covered the city, and the feeling of cold was intensifying by the hour. The crew seemed nervous. It wasn't obvious at first, but upon closer observation, I noticed that the crew members were exchanging quick glances as if there was an unspoken agreement among them not to talk about something. I approached the lobby to ask about the man who had disappeared the night before, but apparently no one knew who I was talking about. The situation was becoming increasingly disconcerting. I headed to the harbor to investigate further. The city, or what I could see of it through the fog, seemed to be shrouded in an eerie silence. The deserted streets and bitter cold created an atmosphere of desolation. No one seemed to be walking around, and the few I saw were hurrying into buildings without a word. I decided to return to the ship, but when I reached the stairs leading to the dock, I saw something that made me stop. There was a man standing at the top of the stairs. He was wearing a dark coat, and his face was covered by the shadow of his hat. Although I couldn't see his eyes, I felt his gaze fixed on me. I couldn't move, and all I could do was stand there watching, waiting for the man to move out of the way. The man finally walked away, but something told me I shouldn't follow him. Instead, I walked deeper into the city, determined to find out what was going on. Everything seemed to indicate that there was something dark behind the stillness. The docks, which should be bustling with life, were empty. The houses along the waterfront had their curtains drawn, and the streetlights shone dimly through the fog. It was as if the city itself was hidden, waiting to be forgotten. Several hours passed before I decided to return to the ship, my mind now filled with unanswered questions. As I approached, a crew member saw me and motioned for me to come closer. He looked concerned, and when I asked him about the missing man, his eyes darkened. He didn't say a word, but his gesture told me he already knew who I was referring to. Something didn't add up. Later that afternoon, the crew called an impromptu meeting with the passengers. We were informed that one of the passengers had disappeared from his cabin, and that the port authorities were investigating the incident. But instead of reassuring me, that explanation only sowed more doubt. The fact that the crew seemed so disoriented left me uneasy. If it really had been a simple accident, why didn't anyone seem to have clear answers? That evening, while dining in the dining room, I watched as the staff began to make discreet adjustments to the ship's routines. Waiters were waiting tables with an air of awkwardness, and the captain was absent, which was unusual. The feeling that something important was being hidden was imminent, and my obsession to discover the truth grew even more. I decided that that very night I would go to explore the area of the ship where the man had disappeared. Something told me that I would find more clues there. As I crept through the dark corridors, I came across a door that seemed to have been hastily closed. I couldn't help my curiosity, and without a second thought I opened it. What I found left me cold. In a small room, several boxes were stacked next to a desk covered with papers. One of the papers that fell to the floor contained a passenger list. As I read it, a growing sense of horror enveloped me. The name of the missing man was there, but what puzzled me even more was what was written next to it. On standby. On standby for what? And why would someone have placed such a message? It was then that I realized that what had happened on this trip was not a simple accident. The man who had disappeared had been part of something much bigger. Something sinister that involved several passengers and possibly the entire crew. I returned to my cabin, my mind on fire. I couldn't ignore what I had discovered, but I also didn't know what to do with the information. The ship was trapped in fog, and the coastal city seemed to have swallowed all the secrets it held. In the end, I decided that my only option was to continue my journey, but not before trying to unravel the mystery. Something told me that this was not a simple cruise, and that the answers I sought were hidden in the shadows, waiting to be discovered. The last voyage had begun, and I knew I could not escape without discovering the truth that lurked behind every corner of the ship. But at the same time, I wondered if I really wanted to know what was to come. It all started one gray autumn afternoon when the fog began to envelop the streets of my neighborhood, partially obscuring the trees and houses as it slowly crept over the wet pavement. The air was crisp, a little cooler than it usually was for this time of year, and the sound of leaves crunching underfoot was the only thing that broke the silence. I was on my way home after a long day at work, my mind still occupied by the unfinished business I had to attend to. However, as I passed through the alley behind the local grocery store, something caught my eye. It was an old wall, made of gray bricks and worn by the years, which was part of the property of an abandoned house, or at least that's what I thought. I had passed by it 1,000 times without paying much attention to it, but that afternoon something on its surface made me stop. It was a flash, as if a shadow had slipped quickly over the wall. At first, I thought it was just the play of light and shadow caused by the clouds and the dim light of the sun. But as I got closer, something made me shudder. On the wall, right in the center, was an inscription. It was not at all sophisticated or well written, but the words seemed to have a strange charge, as if they were there for a purpose. The message, though partially covered by moisture and cracks, was clear. It was written in red ink, or at least it appeared to be, and it read, "What you seek is closer than you imagine. Search among the remnants of the past." My breath hitched for a moment. I didn't quite understand what it meant, but a strange feeling of unease came over me. Why was it there? Who had written it? It didn't make sense that such a cryptic message would appear in that forgotten place. I looked around, but the alley was empty. I decided I had better be on my way, but something inside me couldn't stop thinking about those words. That night, while eating dinner at home, the message came back to my mind. It was strange how it affected me, how it had stuck in my mind. It wasn't just the discomfort of the message itself, but the feeling that there was something else, something to do with me. I couldn't stop thinking about it, so I got up from the table and went to my grandfather's old trunk that he kept in the attic. I felt I had to look for something I couldn't identify, but which was somehow connected to what I had read. As I rummaged through the trunk, I found several old things: letters, photographs, yellowed documents, souvenirs of a distant era that I could hardly remember anymore. Among them, a folder with newspaper clippings caught my attention. The folder was a bit damp, as if it had been stored there for years untouched. The clippings were from a series of strange occurrences that happened in the neighborhood when I was a kid. Stories of disappearances, rumors of clandestine activities, and even mentions of a family that had been last seen under mysterious circumstances. Among all those clippings, however, something made me pause. I found a photograph that chilled my blood. It was a picture of my house, taken from the street, with a date written on the back, 1984. At first, I didn't understand the meaning of that picture. The house in the picture was the same, but something didn't fit. I looked more closely. In the lower right corner, there was something blurry, almost imperceptible, that seemed to move. Something that, at first, I took as a shadow, but then I began to question. What was it? Who had photographed it? The uneasiness I felt that night did not dissipate, but rather grew. As the days went by, I became more obsessed with the message on the wall and the photograph I had found. What did my family have to do with all this? What had happened during that time? I decided to investigate further, although I had no idea where to start. At first, I tried to ask the older neighbors, those who had lived on the street forever. However, no one seemed to remember anything in particular about the message on the wall or the strange events of the 1980s. Most of the answers were evasive, as if everyone was trying to forget, as if there was something they preferred to keep hidden. One afternoon, as I was walking near the wall, I noticed something else. The paint that had partially covered the message seemed to have worn off, and the words were now more legible. "Your father knew," it read. My heart beat faster as I read it. What was the message talking about? Why was it mentioning my father? I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something dark, a secret that didn't want to be discovered, seemed to be hovering in the air. Upon returning home that night, I made a decision. I went into the basement, where I had always kept old things, and started going through the papers that belonged to my parents. Among the boxes of personal items, I found a wooden box. Inside it were more documents, some with names I didn't recognize, some with dates that didn't match any part of our family history. But it was a white envelope, sealed with wax, that caught my eye. I opened it carefully, and inside I found a letter, in handwriting I recognized immediately. It was from my mother, but it was addressed to someone else. The letter spoke of a situation I had never heard of. It spoke of secrets my mother had kept for years, of decisions that had been made in silence, and of an arrangement with someone she knew, but whose name she never revealed. The tone of the letter was tense, desperate, as if my mother was trying to hide something important. I couldn't help but feel overwhelmed, and a sense that everything I had thought I knew about my family was beginning to crumble. The letter ended with a warning. If you ever find this, it's too late. What happened can't be undone. My stomach twisted as I read those words. What did it all mean? Why had my mother written something so cryptic? Why was there something so dark in our family that had never been revealed to me? I decided I had to confront him. I had to understand what was going on. The next morning, I headed to the local historical archive to do more research on the disappearance of the family mentioned in the newspaper clippings. There, among old news stories and forgotten documents, I found a series of police reports detailing an old case, one that had been shelved and closed without explanation. At first, the report seemed to refer to a series of minor burglaries in the neighborhood, but as I read deeper, I discovered something that took my breath away. The missing family the clippings spoke of was linked to my own family. There was evidence that my father had been involved in the investigation in his later years. Not only that, but the dates coincided with the same dates my mother had written the letter. But the truth came out. My family had been involved in a web of deceit, and my father, in his eagerness to protect us, had made decisions that had dragged us into the same abyss. The disappearance of that family was not an accident or an isolated event. It had been part of a much bigger secret, an affair that my family had wanted to hide at all costs. The message on the wall had been just the beginning. In the end, I understood that the truth, though painful, had been waiting to be discovered, and that, perhaps, the fate of our family was marked by those dark secrets that should never have been kept. I had always dreamed of having a home of my own, something away from the city, a quiet place where I could escape the hustle and bustle, a haven where I could find peace. That's why when I found the house in the forgotten neighborhood, I couldn't resist. The house had a melancholic air, almost charming, despite the obvious decay it showed with the passage of time. With its gray facade and broken windows, its garden overgrown with weeds, and its walls of peeling stone. No one seemed to have lived there in years, but something inside called to me. I didn't care that the house was almost in ruins. I was ready to renovate it, to give it a new life. When I bought it, I knew it would be a challenge, but deep down I was eager to embark on this adventure. From the first day, I felt strangely comfortable there, as if something was waiting for me. Maybe it was the quietness of the place, or maybe it was the illusion of building a future in that space forgotten by everyone. The afternoon I first arrived, the weather was gray and gloomy. Drizzle was falling steadily, adding a somber atmosphere to the scene. Despite the dark clouds covering the sky, I felt a strange serenity. I decided to start with the cleaning, at least try to tidy up what was left of the house before I began work on the renovation. As I went through the rooms, I swept away the layers of dust and debris that accumulated in every nook and cranny. The house was full of old furniture, worn out and covered in a layer of dirt. But what struck me most was the sheer amount of personal items still left behind. Boxes of memorabilia, stacked books, broken pictures and framed photos. Everything was there, untouched, as if the former owners had left overnight, leaving everything behind. The furniture, the belongings, even the letters on the floor. Strangest of all, there seemed to be no sign of a move. Simply put, the house had been abandoned, as if time had stopped running there. One night, when the sound of rain on the roof was the only thing breaking the silence, I found myself in the attic. I decided to investigate a little more. The place was dusty and cramped, but my curiosity was pushing me on. As I began to move the old trunks and open the boxes, I found something that chilled my blood. At first I thought it was just a pile of old items, but as I got closer, I saw what it was. An old photo album, with a worn cover and yellowed pages. I opened it cautiously, fearful that time had done more damage than was already visible. The images were mostly black and white, but what captured my attention was not the quality of the photos, but the people in them. The same house, with the same walls that now surrounded me, in the background of all the photos. But the people, the former owners, had a strange look, a kind of sadness that I could not identify. At first I thought it was just the effect of the passage of time on their faces, but as I turned the pages, I felt a growing sense of unease. At the end of the album, one photo stood out among all the others. It was a picture of a man and a woman holding a little girl in their arms. The man and the woman had an empty expression, as if they were looking beyond the camera, and the little girl, though small, seemed to have a sad look, as if she already knew something that the others did not. Something about that image disturbed me deeply. I couldn't take my eyes off her. Later that evening, while I was deep in thought, I began to research the former owners of the house. I headed to the local library, where I found some records about the family. The Evanses, they were called. According to the records, the family had lived in the house for many years. It had been a seemingly ordinary family, but something dark lurked in their history. The father, a man named Thomas Evans, had been a respected businessman in the city. The mother, Sarah, and her daughter, Emily, had been described as kind and friendly people, always willing to help their neighbors. However, everything changed one stormy night. In 1972, the family disappeared without a trace. There were no signs of a struggle, no evidence to indicate a crime. The police conducted a thorough investigation, but found nothing. The house was apparently intact. The family's clothes were still in their closets, the food was still in the pantry, but they never appeared again. It was as if they simply vanished. No one understood what had happened. The neighbors heard nothing strange, and those who knew the Evanses claimed that everything was in order. No one seemed to have a logical explanation. I returned to the house later that afternoon, determined to investigate further. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still cloudy, foreshadowing more storms. Upon re-entering, the house seemed gloomier than ever. As I made my way to the living room, something caught my eye. On the floor, near one of the walls, was a small box covered in dust and dry leaves. Opening it, I found a number of items that appeared to be of great personal value. An antique pocket watch, a handwritten letter, and a series of disorganized photographs. The photos appeared to be recent, taken in the same house. But what was disturbing was not only the date, but the faces in them. They were the same as the previous photos, but more recent, and the girl in the photos seemed to have grown up, though not quite. As I looked at them closely, I noticed something even more disturbing. The same people who had disappeared years before seemed to be in the house once again, as if they had never left. I began to examine the letter, which was carefully folded. When I opened it, I found handwritten words in faded ink. The handwriting was the same as in the photo, and it read as follows: "We are leaving, but our mark will remain here. Someone will find the truth, but will not know how to handle it. This house holds our history, our tragedy. It's not just a home, it's a refuge of secrets. Don't let the past consume you." Fear gripped me as I read those words. I didn't understand what they meant, but something inside me told me that the answers were here, in this forgotten house. The Evans family had disappeared without a trace, but why? What had really happened to them? That night the rain returned, harder than ever. The sound of the drops hitting the roof was deafening, as if the house itself was begging to be heard. I decided to return to the attic, looking for more clues, something that might shed light on the mystery. As I climbed the stairs, a strange sensation ran up my back, as if someone was watching me. In the attic, the light was dim, and the air was heavy with the smell of dampness. It was there that I found an old chest, covered by a torn blanket. I opened it carefully, and in doing so, discovered a series of letters and photographs that belonged to Sarah Evans. In them, she spoke of her fears, of the disturbing visions she had had in the last few months before she disappeared. She wrote about strange voices in the house, about a sense of being watched, and about an unseen presence following her. In one of the most recent letters, Sarah mentioned an arrangement with someone who promised to help her escape, but whose name she would not reveal. As I read the last words of the letter, I realized something terrifying. The Evans family had not disappeared. They were gone, but not of their own free will. Something had forced them to abandon everything, to leave their home behind. Something dark and sinister had taken control of their lives. When I stopped reading, the sound of the rain seemed to have disappeared, and a deep silence enveloped the house. Suddenly, I understood that the house itself was a mute witness to past tragedies, a place where secrets never fade. The Evans story, their pain and their imprint, lived on in the objects they left behind, in the letters and photographs waiting to be discovered. At that moment, I realized that the house didn't just hold memories. It was a refuge of shadows, a place where the tragedies of the past do not fade, but remain, waiting to be revealed. And now, I was part of that story. The invitation came unexpectedly on a cold November afternoon, when the sunlight was beginning to fade behind the gray clouds. At first I thought it was a joke, some kind of mistake, but the letter was official, with the emblem of the local police. I looked at myself in the mirror, wondering why anyone would want to remind me of that event that had left invisible scars on my soul. The date was marked, and the envelope contained more than just words. It brought a sense of discomfort, as if I were being dragged back to a place I had tried to forget. The fire happened 6 years ago, but for me it was still a recent memory, something that still hurt every time I thought about it. My sister Emma had died in that fire. She was there, in her apartment, when the flames consumed everything. The fire had swept through everything in a matter of minutes, and no one could do anything. She was alone in that place, with no way out. That night, smoke covered the city. The darkness was dense, and the sound of sirens was no longer enough to save her. The loss was devastating, and although the police concluded that it was an accident, I always had the feeling that something was wrong. Something was not right. I received the invitation while sitting in front of a cup of coffee, staring into the void. The envelope was simple, unadorned, just a message. The past has something to tell you. Come to the place of the fire. The time has come to know the truth. And underneath, the date and time, exactly the same day, 6 years later. The decision to go was not an easy one. For years, he had avoided returning to the place. The building that had once been his home was now empty, sealed off, and had been marked as a tragedy. Still, that invitation awakened something inside me, an unfulfilled need to find answers, to understand what had really happened. The appointed day arrived, and the city seemed different. Although the air was still laden with the same gray humidity I hated so much. When I arrived at the site, I felt as if I were returning to a bad dream. The building where Emma had lived stood before me, silent and forgotten, its windows dark and walls blackened by time. I remembered the pictures I had seen from that night, the firefighters battling the flames, the blue and red lights of the patrol cars illuminating the night sky, and the faces full of despair. Now, everything was calm, but something inside me told me it was not an end. When I arrived, I met a few people, all of them with a distant look, as if they were there out of obligation rather than interest. None of them seemed particularly willing to talk. A feeling of discomfort came over me, but I decided to move on. A broken door that had never been repaired stood open, as if inviting me to enter. I walked into the building. The place was dark, the air was thick, and the sound of my footsteps echoed on the floor covered with rubble and dust. There was almost nothing left of what had been a lively home. The walls, blackened by smoke, still bore traces of what had happened there. Everything was covered with a layer of ash that seemed to have adhered to the surfaces over the years. I continued walking to Emma's apartment. When I opened the door, the place was in ruins. The furniture, now skeletal and burned, was no more than broken fragments. But in the center of the room, among the rubble, there was something that caught my eye. An intact object, It was a small box, seemingly out of place in the midst of the destruction. I approached it cautiously, and when I lifted it, a number of papers were scattered on the floor. They were letters, photos, and documents, all well preserved despite the flames. As I began to look through them, I felt a knot in my stomach. The letters were Emma's, letters she had written during the last few months of her life. In them, she talked about her work, her dreams, and what surprised me, her fears. Emma had never been one to express fear, but in those papers I read something I hadn't seen before. She had written about someone who was following her, someone she couldn't see, but felt close. In one of the letters, she mentioned that someone had been entering her apartment without permission, moving things around, looking for something. She said she felt she was being watched. Fear grew in me as I read. Who was behind this? Why didn't he mention it before? Why didn't anyone around him notice anything strange? I bent down to pick up more papers, but then a figure appeared in front of me, blocking my view. It was a man wearing a leather jacket with a cold stare. His presence startled me, but he didn't seem to be there to scare me. He silently looked at what was in his hands and then spoke quietly. "I knew you would come." I did not respond, but the man continued. She knew too much, and she knew it before the fire. Emma was the only one who saw what was really going on in this building. What did he mean by that? What had my sister seen? The man stared at me, and although he said nothing more, his look was enough for me to understand that there was something I should know. However, he did not tell me. He only gave me a little hint. The answer is under your feet. Confused, I looked around. What did that mean? Without another word, the man turned around and disappeared into the shadows of the hallway. I decided to follow him, but soon realized he was gone. I was alone again, standing in the middle of that dark and dilapidated place. I returned to the center of the room and, with trembling hands, began to inspect the floor. After a few minutes, I noticed something strange. On the floor, there was a wooden slab that seemed slightly misaligned. I knelt down and tried to move it. When I succeeded, I discovered a small hidden compartment. Inside, there were more papers, more letters and photographs. This time, the documents were more recent. One of the letters, signed by a name I did not recognize, mentioned a series of suspicious financial transactions linked to the construction of the building. There were people's names, addresses, and account numbers. Apparently, Emma had been investigating something much bigger, something to do with the building itself and the corruption surrounding it. It wasn't just an accident. The fire had somehow been planned. Everything began to fall into place. Emma had not only been the victim of an accident, she had been a victim of a plot. The fire had been set to cover the tracks of something much darker. And although she didn't have all the pieces of the puzzle, she now understood why Emma had been so afraid. She had discovered the truth, and it had put her in danger. With my mind agitated, I left the apartment, leaving behind the evidence I had found. The man, the letters, the photos. It all made sense, but at the same time, it was all so confusing and dangerous. In that instant, my life changed forever. I had discovered something I had never imagined, something that had been hidden from me for so long. As I left the building, the rain began to fall again, but I didn't care. The drops hit my face, mingling with the tears that had inadvertently begun to fall. Emma was gone, but now I knew the truth. And that truth was darker and more dangerous than I had ever imagined. The past had returned, and with it, the flame of a tragedy that would never cease to burn in my soul. It was one of those cold winter nights when the darkness seemed to swallow everything. The biting wind was seeping through the cracks in the windows, and the sky, covered by heavy clouds, did not let in even the slightest light. I walked around the neighborhood, looking for something I didn't quite know what it was. Maybe just the need to clear my mind, to flee from the shadows that haunted my thoughts. The air, so icy and silent, seemed to envelop everything in a kind of eerie calm. I had always considered my neighborhood a quiet, even boring place. The uncluttered streets, brick houses, and manicured lawns made for a common landscape, but that had never made me feel really connected to the place. It was a place I had lived in for years, but I had never really felt at home. There was something about its stillness, that gave me a strange feeling of emptiness, of being lost in a space that didn't belong to me. That night, while walking aimlessly, I discovered something that would change my perspective forever. A path I had never noticed before opened up between two wooden fences. At first, I stopped, staring at the narrow passageway as if it were out of place. I couldn't remember seeing it before, and that sense of newness aroused my inexplicable curiosity. There was no sign indicating what lay at the end of the path, but something inside me urged me on. The night was especially dark. The street, normally lit by street lamps, now looked like a black tunnel, with no light source to break the gloom. My footsteps echoed on the cobblestone floor as I made my way down the path, the icy breeze cutting my face. As I moved forward, I felt a strange pressure in the air, as if time itself had stopped. There was something deeply unsettling about the place, as if everything around me was waiting for me to make some kind of mistake. At the end of the passage, a small garden opened up. It was not large, far from it, but what made it special was its appearance. There was something strange about the way the plants grew there, orderly, but at the same time, as if they were about to step outside the limits imposed by nature. The bushes were so dark green that they looked almost black, and the flowers, mostly wilted, gave the impression of having been there longer than they should have. The first thing that caught my eye was a tree in the center of the garden. It was not just any tree. Its trunk was twisted, as if the force of its growth had been shaped by something alien to nature. The branches seemed to stretch toward the sky, but its leaves did not move, did not react to the wind that passed through them. It was as if time had stopped around this tree, as if the garden itself were trapped in a state of suspension. I approached cautiously, observing every detail. There was no sound, only the crunching of my boots on the frozen ground. The atmosphere was heavy, and I felt that something was watching me, although there was no one there. My eyes roamed the garden, searching for some clue as to what made it so peculiar. It was then that I saw it. A small stone, half buried in the grass, with an inscription that was barely discernible. I bent down to examine it more closely. The inscription read, "Only he who looks beyond will be able to see the truth." The message was simple, but somehow disturbing. What did it mean? What truth was waiting to be discovered? I decided to continue investigating. I walked around the garden, touching the plants with my fingers, looking for something else that might reveal the mystery of that place. I couldn't explain why, but I felt there was something in that garden that I had to understand. I sat by the tree, my mind full of unanswered questions. The night was getting longer, and the cold was starting to penetrate my bones, but something kept me there. Something was pushing me to keep exploring. As I looked closer, I saw something I hadn't noticed before, a small path that opened up behind the tree, almost hidden by the fallen branches. It was a narrow path, covered by a layer of moss and dry leaves. I got up and, without thinking too much about it, started walking along it. As I advanced, I felt how the air became denser, heavier, as if the path itself was absorbing everything around it. The path led me to a small stone structure, a sort of ruin that looked like it had been there for centuries. The structure was half hidden by vines and moss, but as I got closer, I could see that it was a kind of ancient stone bench, covered by the passage of time. Around it, there were more stones, some with inscriptions, others without any engraving. At that moment, I felt a strange sensation in my chest, as if something had touched me, as if the air itself was changing. I looked around me, but no one was there. However, the feeling of being watched persisted, and each step I took seemed to take me further and further away from the reality I knew. The garden, the path, the stone structure, everything was beginning to feel like a dream, as if I were trapped in a place that did not belong to this world. Suddenly, something caught my attention. A figure in the distance, barely visible in the shadows. I couldn't see it clearly, but its presence made me stop in my tracks. I couldn't tell if it was a person or just an illusion, but something inside me told me I had to go there. I walked slowly, my footsteps echoing in the absolute silence of the garden. The closer I got, the clearer the figure became. It was a man, standing next to one of the rocks, looking towards the horizon. He made no movement, just stood there, motionless. When I was close enough, I stopped. The man did not move. His face was hidden by the shadow of his hood, but I felt that he was watching me, even though I couldn't see his eyes. My mind was full of questions, but a sense of anguish ran through me. I couldn't say why, but I knew something wasn't right. This place, this figure, everything seemed designed to disorient me, to bring me to a point where I could not escape. Without realizing it, the figure began to walk towards me, his footsteps so soft I could barely hear them. The wind began to stir the branches of the trees, as if nature itself was reacting to his presence. The man stopped in front of me, and for a moment, I didn't know what to do. I felt caught in his gaze, though I couldn't see his eyes. There were no words, only a presence that surrounded me. When the man raised a hand, pointing toward the garden, I realized what was happening. The garden, everything I had seen, everything I had felt, was part of a much larger plan. Every stone, every inscription, every plant, everything was part of a pattern that had been waiting to be discovered. And now, looking at it all over again, I understood that the garden was just a representation of my own life, of everything I had ignored, everything I had tried to hide. The man said nothing, but somehow, his presence made it clear to me that I had reached a point of no return. What I found in that garden, in that secluded place, would not only change me forever, but would also reveal the truth about what I had been searching for all this time. My life, my past, my present, everything was interconnected in that forgotten space. Suddenly, a terrifying thought came over me. The garden was not an isolated place. The garden was inside me and always had been.